hire employees, and provide good-paying jobs to our state's residents is adversely affected by the shortage of qualified and diverse candidates. While we have been able to fill a number of our open positions ranging from customer service to finance, our company has had difficulty in finding qualified applicants for many highly skilled trade and technician roles. For example, DTE could not effectively identify a sufficient number of lineman candidates, a job with an anticipated attrition rate of 35% over the next 5 years. In response to this specific challenge, DTE has had to partner with a number of community organizations and local colleges to establish boot camps and develop foundational math and science curricula with the goal of increasing the number of qualified applicants eligible for these jobs. The challenge continues in filling other highly technical roles. These roles require applicants to have a solid high school math and science problem-solving foundation, a foundation that would be supported by Common Core state standards and the Smarter Balance assessment. With a projected attrition rate of almost 35% of our entire talent force over the next 5 years, mainly due to retirements, the need to fill open positions with diverse and well-educated adaptive learners is a critical concern for our company. And this is why educational excellence is one of the Detroit Regional Chamber's primary economic development priorities. The challenges that DTE faces on a company level are mirrored by other chamber members, employers around the rest of the region. The Workforce Intelligence Network, a nonprofit data analysis organization, regularly tracks real-time data on job openings in Southeast Michigan. Among its recent findings, there have been over 111,000 job postings in the 9-county Southeast Michigan area in the last 3 months. This is up 16.5% from the same period in 2012. The largest share of jobs, over 13%, posted by category, are in the computer and math fields and include software developers, computer system analysts, computer support specialists, and database administrators. According to WIN's analysis, there is 1 active job seeker for every 3.5 openings. While demand is growing in these areas, the supply of qualified candidates is not. Engineers continue to be in demand, particularly mechanical, industrial, and electrical. In these fields, there is currently 1 active job seeker for every 2 openings. Conversely, the WIN analysis shows that there are about 2 active job seekers for each opening in lower skilled occupations like retail. While there are jobs going unfilled, we are all painfully aware that far too many of Michigan citizens are unemployed and lacking the skills to fill these openings. Understanding the relationship between educational excellence and economic prosperity, the Detroit Regional Chamber and its members have a long-standing commitment to educational improvement initiatives. The Detroit Regional Chamber Foundation, with the funding support of DTE and other corporate and private foundations, administers scholarship programs that provide access to post-secondary education for hundreds of students in Detroit every year. The Chamber was a founding member of Excellent Schools Detroit, which just published a report card on school performance building by building to help parents make informed choices for their students. The Chamber is currently developing a program to help recruit business and community leaders to serve on the boards of charter academies. There are obviously no silver bullets or quick fixes to correct the labor imbalances that I cited earlier. However, we do believe the solution begins with a solid educational foundation for all students. Unfortunately, when we look at our K-12 system, we observe that in recent years, Michigan students of different races and income levels have fallen behind their demographic peers across the country in national testing. Today, Michigan consistently ranks near the bottom tier of states in both performance and improvement on national reading and math tests, overall and by racial group and income levels, in both 4th and 8th grades. And as Doug has noted, ACT testing results tell us that too many graduates in too many districts across the state are simply not college ready. As my colleagues have already stated, the Common Core state standards establish benchmarks for competencies students need to master at each grade, while leaving it to local districts to determine how best to do that. If we want to offer our citizens a path to careers that pay family-sustaining wages and the kind of workforce that will attract additional high-wage jobs to our state, we have to dramatically change these trends. We simply can't afford to have students from one school district less academically proficient than students from the district next door, or across the state, or across the country, or across the globe. I join my colleagues in urging you to continue with the implementation of Common Core state standards. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. Representative Shore?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Microphone doesn't work. Well, first, thank you for being here, for testifying. Mr. Rothwell, I thought it was interesting you talked about how not only the urban districts, but all districts were kind of lower than expected, although then Mr. Cloyd said that the urban districts and the rural districts had a great disparity, so that is disappointing to hear. My question is, as you talk about Michigan versus other states or even other countries, when you look backwards kind of in the history of businesses, especially recent history, do you see them hiring students from other states before hiring students from Michigan, or even coming from other countries? Is that the experience that we have getting to this point where the argument has been made the Common Core needs to level the playing field, so we all, regardless if we move to San Francisco or wherever, we're all in the same educational level and we graduate with the same experience? Do you see that as past history of businesses? If two students apply and one's from Michigan and one's from some other state, do you see Michigan students losing out on those jobs?
Representative, I think the way I'd answer your question is more that what's happened is that the requirements that business and what jobs require today has simply been increasing dramatically, especially over the last decade or so. And we know that the importance of having an educated workforce is rising on the priority list of businesses in terms of where they decide to expand and where they decide to add jobs. And the concern I think that we have is that if you look around the country, the places that are really doing best in terms of job creation, and particularly good job creation, tend to have much better educated workforces than we do. Then you contrast that with some of the things that Brian and Paul and I have spoke up here on the panel about, where actually our performance has declined relative to other states over the last 10 years. And our concern is that not only are we seeing today in real-time basis the inability to fill jobs in our state because we don't have the level of education that many of our kids require to fill those jobs, but it's probably going to get worse at the rate that we're going right now. So that's why I think we feel that it's so important to move forward with these standards, because in and of themselves, they're not going to fix the problem, but they do give us the chance to be able to at least have a common way of measuring how well we're doing relative to these other places that we are competing with for jobs and investment. That's just within the United States, let alone against the rest of the world. I don't know, Brian and Paul, if you wanted to comment on that at all or not.
Yeah, I would agree with Doug's comments, and at Steelcase, and I know a lot of larger manufacturing companies have the same situation. We've created a university within the company, for a couple of reasons. One, because it becomes a resource for us, to train new employees coming into the company that are lacking in the skills that are necessary for success in our company. And secondly, to retrain existing employees, with in the areas that are rapidly changing. This notion of global competitiveness, has been something that that we've been battling against, for the past couple of decades, trying to keep pace, trying to make sure that that we stay relevant and increase our innovative capability in order to compete in the world. We have to train people. We talk about the notion of lifelong learning. If you have people that come into the company that don't have the proper educational foundation, it's really impossible to have the flexibility to increase their learning so that they can continue to be productive in their careers.
Do you find that Steelcase takes more people into the university that are from out of Michigan or within Michigan because they're not prepared, that you're more likely to recruit or bring in someone that's not from Michigan?
Well, that in relative terms, we train both our hourly employees, manufacturing employees, and our knowledge workers, and since the larger percentage are knowledge workers, we've done extensive training with them as manufacturing continues to increase and become more focused on higher levels of technical knowledge. We have increased that. In terms of our knowledge workers, as I said in my statements, we will go wherever we can to find the best and brightest, and if we can't find them in Michigan, we'll go other places to find them.
Mr. Speaker, did you have anything to add?
Well, in terms of where we look to do business, we're in a slightly different situation. As a regulated electric and gas utility, we have fixed service territories, but it is in our interest that those territories continue to grow. So this is not only a talent issue for us, and as I said earlier, we have a good number of retirements, over a third of our workforce coming up in the next few years. And the competition for not only the technical positions I cited, but engineers, for example, is going to grow far more intense and is a great concern. In our search for talent, and we are spending a great deal more money in training and testing incoming talent, we take the talent that is available. We work most closely with state universities and community colleges, but I would only observe that the graduates from those universities and community colleges in the STEM fields are increasingly diverse and international.
Thank you. Representative McMillan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know how many follow-up questions, so I might try and pack it all in here, but I guess I want to get to the idea of overlaying a business model on the education, because I'm a former CFO and CPA. I understand benchmarking and metrics, and I could tell you when I was in CFO and CEO or COO, how quickly, what ring we answer the phone in our customer service, how quickly, what day of the month we got our reports out. I understand that, but if an employee wasn't doing well, we could, ultimately, if we tried to work with them, we could let them go. We could bring other people on. In education, and also anybody who applied didn't get a job. In education, is quite a bit different. They don't exclude people. They come in and you take whoever kids are in your district. You don't let them go if they're not doing well or if they're not following the prescribed way of doing things. So, I'm really kind of wondering if what we're pinning all our hopes on, benchmarking against China. I mean, I can't believe when Michelle Reese said we need to be more like China. They have no freedom in China. They have no innovation in China. They have no entrepreneurial spirit. They steal all of our stuff. So I mean, I really wonder if our goal is the wrong goal. This, try to lay a business model upon education, and it's actually Dr. Zhao, Young Zhao, who used to be at MSU, he testified before the Education Committee a few years ago, and is now in Oregon. His specialty is education and innovation and globalization and how to deal with that. And he says that he cites a study that's an inverse relationship between the scores on the PISA tests internationally and entrepreneurship. So those countries that focus on making sure their kids fill in bubbles well, they do that to the exclusion of the arts and the things that really make creativity and innovation and people really be ready for what's coming. We cite 2025. I guarantee, if I asked you to try to explain what 2025 is going to be like, I guarantee you'd be thousands of percent off. I mean, I don't know who would have thought that, you know, this iPhone would be around 13 years ago or 12 years ago. So I guess my question is, how do you know, first, is it fair to overlay a business model upon education when it's such a different dynamic where our goal is not profit, our goal is something about helping to build up citizens and self-governing citizens, and we're not there to create output and widgets and whatever business needs and the society needs. So is it fair to do that? And also, my second question is, how do you know that this is the right solution? You mentioned academic achievement. I think we're going to hear from Dr. Ravitch. She feels that the Common Core and Smarter Balance testing could increase. And it looks like it does in New York. It's going to increase. It's going to widen the achievement gap between the rich and the poor, and the minority or a non-minority. So, you know, this is not tested. It actually could do worse. I believe we're going to hear. So, those are my two questions.
Sure. So first of all, I don't think we're talking up here about applying a business model to education. What we're talking about is being realistic about what's happening and what has been happening over the last few decades, which is that increasingly, to go to college or to have a good job, you need more education, and it needs to be a better education than we've been providing. That's why, in Michigan's case, for example, back to a question we saw earlier, what's the experience of Michigan versus other states? It at least is a reason why Michigan's unemployment rate is higher than the national average, because our education system here is producing an education that is below the national average right now. Well, let me answer your question before you interrupt.
Okay.
The other is that if you look at New York and what happened in New York, the issue there is that in fact it revealed what the reality is, which is what I talked about earlier, which is that many of our kids are not college or career ready. What those results basically did was just showed more of what we already know. And we are probably going to see results that we don't like when we start measuring against these common standards. We're not going to like the results. But that doesn't mean that we should run away from the data. We should run away from the facts. What we've got to do is then even redouble our efforts to make sure that we put even more effort into education to make sure that our kids are able to compete. It's a reason why, Representative, we see so many of our kids that go to college today that need remedial education. They can't even really, they're struggling to even deal with the basics that college requires today. And it's a reason why I think Brian and Paul talked about the difficulty they're having finding people for many good paying jobs that those companies are creating. So I understand what you're saying, and we're not trying to apply a business model. The issue simply is aligning better than we have what's expected of our kids in the real world with what's expected of them in school.
You know, the notion of what's going to happen in the year 2025, I would agree completely. We don't know. We don't know what jobs there are going to be in 2025. We don't know what new gadgets, you know, there will be there. But that's precisely why we're talking about what we're talking about today. What we do know is this. You know, generally speaking, in the United States, you know, we are leading the world in innovation. That's great. That's fantastic. But we're losing the edge. And we're losing the edge in areas like science and math and reading comprehension. We hire people that, as Doug said, you know, might struggle in college with you know, remediation. They graduate, they come to work for companies like ours. Guess what? They're still struggling. You know, we hire technical people, you know, that need to write a brief on a project they're working on, and they can't communicate effectively. You know, we have you know, other you know, people that you know, have good reading skills, perhaps, you know, but you know, are lacking in the technical skills. We hire foreign nationals that are farther ahead in terms of those technical skills. And we're good in innovation, but the basis, the foundation of that, you know, is reading, math, science, critical thinking, design thinking, the areas that we're pointing out.
And I guess I'll just add that this is an evolution. When I age myself, but when I served in the legislature during the Blanchard years, that's when the real focus began on NEAT testing. And there were concerns then about standardized testing and trying to measure district against district in the state. And I have to confess, over time, I began to get concerned as a policymaker about the reports I were hearing about teaching to a test. I firmly believe, based on the work that our HR folks have been doing with our own testing and their analysis of Common Core state standards, that this is a great improvement, and that's another step in the journey that is focusing more on critical thinking skills and problem solving. I have a son, now a senior at the University of Michigan, who, I don't know where he gets his genes, but he intuitively has been very good at math and has been able to answer math problems very quickly. The harder part for him has been explaining how he reaches the answers, how he does the problem solving. And that's where increasingly the focus is today and needs to be, because what employers are looking for are problem solvers, adaptive learners, people with many different skills, but who have critical thinking, problem solving skills.
Representative O'Brien?
Well, can I get a follow-up?
Oh, go ahead.
So in New York, I mean, I know this is going to be the mantra, is that, okay, we're implementing this and imposing on everybody. It's going to be really bad, and then we got to spend a lot of money and change everything because it's really bad. And so it's classic politics. You got to create a crisis in order to solve a crisis. Could it be that they didn't do well on the test because they weren't prepared for it? I mean, we heard Dr. Schmidt come in here 2 weeks ago and say that none of the textbooks in Michigan are good. And the ones Common Core aligned, they're all worthless and should be thrown away and not purchased. So how are we going to be taking tests when we've got poorly aligned or badly aligned textbooks? So, I mean, there's, there could be numerous reasons why the tests go bad, but the tests did show that the gap is widening with the Common Core, what they're using in New York anyway. And so, I really think that there's a danger, and none of you have actually answered why you think this is going to solve the problem. I understand there's a problem, but some of the things that have been said here, we have the same standards in Benton Harbor and Birmingham and Ontonagon. I mean, we have them right now. There's no reason why we couldn't do better. But we talk about we need these standards. Our math standards are better than the Common Core, and we've had them for years. And yet we're saying that we need a little bit less better in order to get better. I mean, these standards don't necessarily translate into success, apparently. So you're really hanging this on something that I think is very unfounded.
Well, we're not, I don't think that anyone up here is suggesting that the standards by themselves are going to solve the problem. I mean, we'd be the first ones to say that. But you need to know what it is you're shooting for, just like in any entity or any effort you're making. What's the goal? And you're right, Representative, we do have standards now in Michigan. The problem is that they're different in different subject areas versus the rest of the country, the rest of the world, and all we're trying to do, I think, is to say, look, a lot of time was spent by a lot of good people to try to look at what the expectations are of the highest performing areas in the world that we live in today. And let's use those, at least in reading and math, as kind of what we're shooting for, and recognize that today, the results that we're already getting on many of the other assessments that we use that I talked about earlier, whether it's third grade reading proficiency, the percentage of our kids that are deemed college or career ready on the ACT test, we know from all the tests now that our kids are underperforming where they need to. But the difference here is we'll now have at least a benchmark, a yardstick that we can hit, and that these standards provide guidance year to year to year, grade to grade to grade, that we really lack today in terms of a path as to how you can get to that goal. Now, what the curriculum is and how it's taught and such, those are things that have to be decided by educators in every district in the state. But at least there's a goal that we're all shooting for. And I don't think that we're up here saying, okay, well, because the results are bad, we've got to double or triple education spending. There might be some that say that. I don't think we're going to say that. But that doesn't mean that we don't think we have to put more emphasis behind this issue. Frankly, we were surprised when the results came out of the ACT results that only 18% of our kids are career or college ready. We were shocked that that was not a front page headline. I mean, that to me is the travesty of our system right now, and this is a step towards trying to correct that.
Representative Ryan.
Thank you. I have a couple comments which will lead to a question, and feel free to comment and respond to any of them. One, I really appreciate you bringing up this issue that we do have. We have a serious issue about how are our kids learning, how are they then using that information, so I applaud you for addressing that one. And especially the one where we look at children who have different income levels or are different ethnicity or race. That is a serious problem, especially when you look at the African American communities even lagging behind low income whites. That's a big problem that we have to address. So thank you for raising those issues. I do have concerns that not everybody needs to attain a certain level of academics. I was your four-year college prep person. My three brothers were not. Two of them out-earned me. They did not attain the math levels that I did. I did calculus in high school. They struggled to get through geometry. One operates nuclear reactor operators. He's incredibly talented. The other one is a self-taught IT person. Neither needed a college degree to get to where they got. And I have another brother who, at the age of 45, figured out he was smart. He didn't know his whole childhood he was smart. He had other issues he had to deal with. So I'm worried about the late bloomers, which most of my brothers were. They're incredibly intelligent people. One of them, the military, really found his strengths. They do different tests when you get in, and they see where your natural aptitudes are, not have you taken physics. My brother took the bare minimum to graduate and then filled in with technical classes, which he was very good at. He hadn't taken physics, but yet they said, you have an aptitude for science. And they spent a lot of money to educate him in the nuclear field. The Navy did. And so I'm just concerned that when we think everybody needs to attain a certain level, we may actually be discouraging kids who, for my brother's some of the academic courses, they weren't ready for that book learning yet. They were the hands-on learner. And then I'm also worried about so much focus is on technology, but I have two 17-year-olds. I had to make them sign their name 100 times before I'd let them write their signature on their driver's permit. They didn't know how to sign their name. They can't fill out a very good legible job application by hand. I make them rewrite it. Also worried about health and nutrition. Obesity is a huge crisis in our nation. And we look at what qualifies for health and wellness, nutrition, and gym, and that's what's getting squeezed. People may be incredibly smart, but they're killing themselves with their diet and their lack of exercise. For the last 2+ years, I've been dealing with education, teacher evaluation models, student growth measures, and we've been piloting the teacher evaluation models. Common Core has not been piloted. We want to do a nationwide pilot, but yet we have piloted 4 different teacher evaluations in Michigan to say, does it work, before we tell schools, adopt one of these models. Student growth measures, we're right now researching what would be similar to what Common Core is trying to do, which is measure students and their growing. And we're looking for things that have already been proven versus saying, let's throw upon our education community something that hasn't been tested. And now I'll get into the Common Core. I really appreciate you bringing up Portage Public Schools. My kids go there. In fact, one of my former board members is sitting behind you, Melanie Curtis. They keep being listed in Newsweek year after year for being one of the top educational high schools in the nation. But if you say we're not doing well enough, you hate kids. You hate the school system. You are not a supporter. But yet it's clear with only 26% of the kids ready for college out of Portage Public Schools that's recognized nationally, we need to throw that skunk on the table. And people aren't willing to throw that skunk on the table, that we can do better, we must do better. It's not a problem with teachers, it's not a problem, it's a culture problem that everybody is just pointing the finger. So thank you for bringing that issue up. We got to do more, and I'm going to lead, this is my question, I'm sorry, Chairman. They got me fired up. Common Core, I fear, is not evidence-based. It's not been piloted. The parents have been squeezed out. We heard in testimony 2 committee meetings ago when one of my colleagues said, I'm struggling trying to help my 3rd grader. I think it was 3rd grade, wasn't it? One of your young kids with their assignments, and they said Common Core wasn't meant so that parents can help their kids learn. If we're saying, parents, you're not a partner at the table, then I have no responsibility, and it's all the school's fault if my kid's not educated. We got to get parents' skin in the game, and Common Core's not doing that. So anything you have to say, I would love to hear it.
There were a lot of questions packed into that question, Representative, so I'll try my best to do this. You know, one thing that struck me while you were talking about this was something Paul actually said earlier, which is, I think I'm showing my age, but 30-some years ago, in my first job in state government back in another state, was actually being the staff director to a task force on education reform. And it was during Ronald Reagan's days as president, and if you remember, when Ronald Reagan was president, one of his biggest initiatives was education reform. This nation's been talking about education reform for 35 years since. And in the meantime, a lot of other nations and a lot of other places in the world have passed us by. If you look back, actually, 35 years ago, America was near the top of just about every ranking in education. We're now not. I would say there are many examples of Bill Gateses and Steve Jobs that didn't graduate from college that went off and did great things. The reality is that we live in a state today that has an above average unemployment rate and a below average level of income. That's not where we want to be. We know in Michigan that there are going to be more and more jobs that are being created that are good jobs, good paying jobs, that are going to require some level of education beyond what we experienced when we came out of school and what even our kids are going to be experiencing. While the Common Core standards do not track kids into college, what they do is they do give kids the opportunity to decide whether they're going to be able to compete in college or compete in these higher paying careers. It would seem to be a mistake if Michigan decided that we were going to be one of the very few states to not help our kids be able to compete at that level when the majority of the other states in our country are going to move forward.
Excuse me. We've got Diane Ravitch that's going to wait. We've got 2 more questions, so if we could expedite these as quickly as possible. Representative Lipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a brief question in terms of some of the data that was cited. I believe it was in Mr. Rothwell's written testimony. On page 2, the 4th paragraph, one of the data points is 68% of Michigan 3rd graders are reading at proficiency. And the citation for that is the Michigan Education Dashboard, which I have looked at. And it's my understanding, is it not, that the proficiency designation is the proficiency that is defined in No Child Left Behind?
It's the whatever's on the dashboard, Representative. If that's what it is, then that's what it is.
Okay, it is the proficiency that is designated under No Child Left Behind. And are you aware of how federal law defines proficiency?
I'm not an education expert, Representative, so I'm not going to be able to answer that question for you.
Okay, you had mentioned though that you had a decade ago, so
yeah.
But I'll share with you then.
Sure.
Perhaps so proficiency is under No Child Left Behind. It's designated at 50%. 50% of so you're, I believe, saying that 68% of Michigan 3rd graders are reading at above average.
At meeting the standard.
Yes, okay, thank you. The next data point that I wanted to ask you about on page 3, when you cite a number of school districts The benchmark in Berkeley Public Schools, 23%. I believe you are stating that are not career and college ready.
These are the percentages that are college and career ready, according to the
23%.
ACT.
Are college and career ready, okay, and the citation there is the spring 2010-2013 ACT 4-year proficiency data. I represent Berkeley Public Schools, so I'm pretty familiar with the data point that you are using. And it's interesting because Berkeley Public Schools, I just received information from the superintendent that 100% of their graduating class for the past 3 years has matriculated in either a 2- or 4-year college. And interestingly enough, Berkeley has decided to follow those students. And over 90% of the students graduated from a 4-year college within 4 years, and 100% also went on from a 2-year to a 4-year degree. Of course, the ACT benchmark measures the probability of someone receiving an A in a college level class. So I would alert you to be very cautious when you come before the committee, this or others, to be very careful in the data point that you cite, because I can't speak about the other school districts, of course, but in Berkeley Public Schools, I think that probably any international or national benchmark would rank the fact that 100% of their graduating seniors for the past several years have completed a 4-year degree within 4 years would probably qualify as being college ready. I would imagine.
I think it'd be...
At least we like to think so.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Representative Yonker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. And Brian, good to see you again. Sorry I couldn't make your event yesterday, but my staff was there and I got very well briefed. My colleagues, I share some of the same concerns they have, and I was on a school board, which Steelcase was very active in. And during that time, we had a system of education that pretty much mirrors where the Common Core is going. So the Common Core and part of what we're doing, it doesn't alarm me, because I've lived it. My kids went through that type of system as a 4-block school day, and it was project-based, and every course flowed to the other. So if no matter what course you were in, you were learning part of your other course in that system. But it's not a cheap system. And when the Michigan Merit curriculum came through, we had to eliminate a lot of that because we now had to teach our kids much more. So we didn't have the time in a day to have our students cover in depth as much. Life skills was a part of it, but life skills isn't measurable. So we had trouble with the state standards now. And the argument that came to us was, well, our schools aren't performing, we're not performing, so we're going to make a state standard now, and we're going to be rigorous. And all our schools are going to have to meet these benchmarks and this rigor, and they're all going to be good, and our kids will be ready. My last year on the school board, we get reports that came back and says, oh, guess what? None of our kids are college ready. I'm going, what in the world are we doing? So now I see Common Core come. The core standards doesn't alarm me, all right? Because my kids, it's been a great experience for them. My last daughter doesn't have that, and it's not a good experience. But, so we went to a state standard, and we're going to create a successful education. Now we want to step this to a national standard, and that's going to be our answer. And I have a hard time saying let's make this a bigger pool and have more success. Because big business, you guys are there. You know the challenges for quality. How do we create a bigger system and keep quality? And I would like you to touch on this a little bit because you did a good job yesterday, and that is on rigor. The rigor that we have today and the rigor that the Common Core is looking at doing. So if you can kind of touch on those two areas, I'd appreciate it.
So, tell me again, what's the question that you're asking?
All right.
I lost you, and it sounded like the Common Core that, or the books that you had before worked well.
The question one is if we as a state decided we are going to set a state standard for all our schools,
Right.
and we're going to create a very rigorous standard, and we're all going to be successful. Well, that didn't happen. So now we want to take this standard to a national, all right? And we're going to set a national rigor standard. And this will be our answer, all right? So the question is, why do you think that's going to make a difference when it didn't on the state? What's your perception in that area? And then talk about the rigor. How is the rigor in the national standard, the Common Core standard, different than the rigor that we already have in place on our state standard? If you can.
Well, let me describe it this way. You know, as you know, as a business person, you either get better at doing what you're doing, or you go out of business. And you know, we focus a lot on the notion of continuous improvement. You know, setting standards for what you're doing for the products and services, you know, that you're providing, and continuing to improve on those products and services. The only way that you can do that is by setting standards and continually, you know, stretching beyond that, you know, to make sure that you're getting better and better. I made a comment separately yesterday to Representative Lyons that in the business world, and as I know that you're familiar with, we never look at a new product or a new service as being 100% perfect. You know, we do the best that we can with the knowledge that we can, the information that we can, that meets the needs of our customers. We introduce it, and then we continue to improve it every year, until it's, you know, the best, hopefully the best product on the market. That's the same way that I would look at, you know, the notion of Common Core.
Is it?
If we could, Mr. Speaker, if you could quickly just...
Yeah, Representative, if I may quickly add, this is really maybe setting up a conversation with John Austin, who I see is going to be testifying on behalf of the State Board. But if we were not to implement Common Core state standards, it's not like state standards are going to go away. The State Board of Education will have to reinvent some sort of state standard and won't have the advantage of shared experience and shared analysis of results, and probably less expense that it comes when you're working with other states. And this is not national, this is a number of states agreeing on standards that were really initiated by governors, not a president.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to shuffle the order a little bit. We've got Diane Ravitch that's going to be Skyping in. So, Mr. Evers, will delay your testimony until we hear from Ms. Ravitch. So we go at ease until she comes on here. Ms. Ravitch?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, and sorry for the delay. We've had a busy morning so far and look forward to your testimony. You may begin.
Thank you very much. My name is Diane Ravitch. I'm a research professor at New York University. I am a historian of American education. I was Assistant Secretary for Research during the administration of George H.W. Bush, and I was appointed by President Clinton to serve on the National Assessment Governing Board. I spent 7 years on the Federal Testing Board, so I'm familiar with testing and standards issues. I've also worked in several states helping to develop state standards in Massachusetts, California, Georgia, and Texas. I have concerns about the Common Core. I particularly have concerns about the way it was developed, the way it was imposed on the states, with federal, I guess the word is bribes at the top. It was developed by a small group in Washington, D.C. It's an inside the Beltway production. It has never been field tested. I was asked over the past several years by people involved in the development what I thought of the standards, and I said I thought they have some good points. They have some things that concern me very much, particularly the early grades. And I recommended they should field test them before they send them out to the states. There was no interest in field testing. I don't know how you can have a standard that has never been field tested. The fact is that we are told again and again that these standards are benchmarked internationally, and I don't believe they are. We're also told that they will produce students who are college and career ready, but we have no evidence that that's true. They've never been tried anywhere, and we can't say right now whether these are good standards or not good standards. I think what we can say about them with some certainty is that when you test these standards, there's a collapse of test scores. Kentucky was the first to implement the Common Core and to test it. Their proficiency rates of their students fell by 30%. New York State implemented the Common Core, or partially implemented it, and tested it just this past spring, released the results last week. Proficiency rates literally collapsed across the state. What the test showed was that only 30% of the students in the state of New York are considered proficient. The great mistake here is that the New York State, and I believe many other states, are using a bar that is so high that it's going to make children who are actually B students appear to be F students. And only the students who are earning an A will be said to have passed. And that's because the state of New York, and I assume other states as well, are benchmarking these Common Core standards to the NAEP standards, that's the National Assessment Standards, where proficient represents not that you passed, it represents a very high level of superior performance. So we're in effect going to be telling 2/3 of the kids in the state of New York and other states that they're failures when they're not. So I'm very concerned about the Common Core testing. The cost of it is going to be astronomical. It's been calculated by various think tanks that it's going to cost, the testing alone is going to be about, I don't know, $16 billion. I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars your state will spend, but some of the states that have withdrawn from the testing have done so because they cannot afford the bandwidth, and they cannot afford to supply the kinds of computers that are necessary for the testing, because all of the Common Core testing is going to be done on computer. So I'm concerned on many levels. I'm concerned because my review of the standards suggests particularly that the early childhood standards are not appropriate for little children. They're asking little children to do things that are frankly unnecessary. I mean, I don't think it makes much difference if a 6-year-old knows the difference between an uppercase letter and a lowercase letter, but that's one of the standards for first grade. From what I've heard from the early childhood educators, they're very upset with these standards, and they say that they are developmentally inappropriate, and that there was not a single early childhood educator included in the discussion when the standards were written. Now, I'm not saying that the standards as a whole are bad. I'm sure that they have some very good features to them, but I would urge you to go slow. I would urge you not to do the testing and to put off the testing at least for 2 years or 3 years until teachers have had time not only to use the standards and to figure out which are good and which are not good, but also to revise them. One of the things that concerns me a great deal is that there is no place where you can go. And this, let's say in any state, when you develop state standards, you can contact the people who wrote them and say, this doesn't work. What you have written for 5th graders belongs in the 4th grade or the 3rd grade, and what you've written for 5th graders belongs in the 7th grade. So you can make those adjustments. Our teachers can say, this doesn't work in my classroom at all. And if you hear it from a lot of teachers, then you take it out. You figure it doesn't work. There has to be this process of continuous improvement, and yet we have been handed these Common Core standards as if they're written in stone and there's no way to make them better. I think you need to listen to the true experts in Michigan, and that's your classroom teachers. Give them a chance to use these standards, find out what works and what doesn't work, and change them. There's no reason why they should be written in stone. If they don't work for your children, then you should make the necessary revisions listening to teachers. I would suggest a delay in the testing because we know what the testing will do. We've seen this in New York. First, it will collapse your proficiency rates and it will discourage students. It doesn't encourage them to think that after working so hard all year long, they failed because the bar was set so high that they couldn't possibly cross it. The second thing that we know that the testing, the Common Core testing does, is that it increases the achievement gaps. It does not increase equity or equality of opportunity. It causes the struggling students, the students who are currently at the bottom, to drop even further behind. So what we've seen in New York, and what I believe you'll see in every state, is that the gaps between rich and poor, the gaps between suburbs and inner cities, the gaps between blacks and whites, the gaps between Hispanics and whites will grow wider as a result of raising the bar. And many of the people who are supporters of the Common Core are saying, of course, when you raise standards, when you raise the bar, many kids are just not going to cross the bar. So it's a very risky endeavor, and the risk is that kids will be hurt. I wouldn't take that risk. I would go slow. I would defer the testing. I would listen to your teachers and make the adjustments to the standards. I would not treat them as written in stone, but as developmental standards where you have to do what's right for children, and you have to listen to the people who are expert in the classroom who will. There has to be somebody in Lansing in the State Department of Education willing to take that responsibility to say, we're going to improve on the Common Core standards and make them work for Michigan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I might have a question here.
Put your,
I'm sorry. You speak, you don't necessarily disagree with the rigor of the Common Core standards. In fact, you suggest that they are rigorous. Otherwise, you wouldn't expect or suspect that there might be a widening gap between high and low achievers. And if that's the case, would that not be, you worked for 41, but 43 used the kind of the soft bigotry of low expectations. Can you address that?
Well, I don't think that rigor in and of itself is anything that we should strive towards. I look at the dictionary definition of rigor, and it suggests rigid, unyielding, unbending. There are a lot of children who are in our schools now who have tremendous problems learning. They don't need more rigor. They need a teacher who's willing to work with them. They need smaller classes. They need the time to master standards that are achievable. If you have a child or large numbers of children who cannot cross a bar set at 4 feet, raise it to 6 feet, and you're going to see those kids falling farther and farther behind. I don't think that children don't learn more as a result of making the standards harder and more rigorous. I'm all in favor of high standards. I have been all my life. But I think the standards have to be realistic, and there are certainly, the translation of standards is what's in the test. And I can tell you that we have, again, looking at the experience in my own state, New York, we had a test designed by Pearson, which is the biggest test maker in the world, and the Pearson test was, the 5th grade test was written for 8th graders. Now that's not rigorous, that's just plain stupid. If you have kids in 5th grade, you don't give them an 8th grade test and expect them to pass. And that's why the proficiency rates collapsed, because the tests were so hard, they were so complicated, that many kids didn't finish because they could not handle something that was not written at a 5th grade level. You have to have something that's developmentally appropriate.
Thank you.
By the way, I want to say, because I think it's really important to know this, there is this common myth that American education is in deep trouble, that it's declining, that it's failing. I have a book coming out next month in which I assemble all the U.S. Department of Education graphs and demonstrate that none of this is true. Looking at the NAEP scores, which is our federal test that have been given over the past 40 years, achievement in this country has been improving steadily over the past 40 years. The high school graduation rates today are the highest they have ever been. The dropout rates are the lowest they have ever been. And on the international test scores, when you take into account poverty rates and demography, our country is a very high-performing country. So don't believe all the myths that have been circulated. We are a successful country. This nation is the greatest nation in the world. Our public education system has served us well. We have incredible problems in terms of kids who don't speak English, kids with disabilities, the highest poverty rate of any developed nation or advanced nation in the world. All those things drag down scores, and in every country in the world, there is a gap between rich and poor. We just happen to have more poor kids than most advanced countries.
Thank you. Representative McMillan.
Thank you, Dr. Ravitch, for being here, or Skyping in. It's a great honor. I have just two questions, one on testing and one on more local control. I guess 2 weeks ago, Professor Schmidt, who his work was used extensively and maybe even primarily for the math standards, testified and said here, quote, districts that spent $1 million or whatever they spent on their Common Core aligned textbooks, it was probably wasted money, and that there are no serious textbooks worth anything that align to the Common Core, because they don't, that are on the market. So that's what Professor Schmidt said. So given that there is, there's some teacher preparation, but there's nothing that really is out there that even aligns. Is it even fair to have us testing kids with a test that's aligned to the Common Core when one of its premier informers of the Common Core is saying there's no good textbook out there on the market to teach Common Core? Is it fair to do that in a high-stakes testing?
Well, I totally agree with Bill Schmidt, and I've worked with Bill over many years. I think he's one of the best people in the country in terms of math, and I think that there are fewer complaints about the math part of the Common Core than there are about the reading part, the English language arts part. He's absolutely right that if teachers don't have a curriculum that represents what's going to be tested, if they don't have the reading materials and the instructional materials, then it's not fair to test the kids, because the one thing that everybody knows about testing is you can't give a test on something that's not been taught. If they haven't taught it, they're not going to be able to do it on the test. So that the kids will look bad, the teachers will look bad, and it's unfair. So Bill Schmidt's right.
Okay, and then on the local controls is real important, because it's quite a debate here on the committee. What you said, I think, is real important. I just wanted to make sure we all heard it clearly that once we've turned over the standards to the NGA and they're copyrighted, we can't change those here at the state level. So that feedback, it is important to hear from the teachers and hear what's going on and make the changes. Something that's taught, that's a standard in 4th grade, maybe it belongs in 3rd grade, maybe it belongs in 5th. We're not going to have that debate here at the state level. We got to knock on the NGA's door and beg them in a closed meeting. It's not an open meeting to the public. We got to beg them to make changes, and they're going to be hearing from all the other 40 states or whatever. So it just seems like if we're going to, that is a very important thing that we're giving away because we're not going to be able to hear from teachers and hear from parents and really make those changes at the state level.
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot, because I hear from everybody that once the standards are out there, nobody can change them. They were written essentially by the staff, or overseen by the staff at the NGA, and also an organization called Achieve. The Gates Foundation funded their writing, the Gates Foundation funded their development, the Gates Foundation funded their dissemination, the Gates Foundation funded their evaluation, and the Gates Foundation funded every part of the Common Core. Maybe you should ask the Gates Foundation if they will revise it. But, I ask myself, why do you need approval to make changes in something that you voluntarily accepted? I mean, this is not something that comes in a locked box and you don't have a key. Your standards should be what you want your state standards to be. Right. And that's why what I'm suggesting is you take the Common Core, you listen to your teachers, and if the teachers say that this isn't working, and that kids in 1st grade can't write an essay or don't know what a preposition is, I mean, this is ridiculous. I have a 6-year-old grandson. He doesn't know what a preposition is, but the Common Core standard says he's supposed to know all the prepositions. So if you find out these things aren't working, change them. What are they going to do to you? Are they going to take your federal funding away? There's a law that says the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education, is prohibited from interfering with curriculum or instruction in any public school in America. So what is NGA going to do if you change your standards? If you say we're going to adopt the parts of the Common Core that work for us, and we're going to change those that don't work for us, what are they going to do to you? They have no control over you.
Representative Rod or Shore?
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Ravitch. I appreciate the testimony. I want to challenge a few things that you said based on previous testimony that we've heard. First, but you led off with talking. You said that it was developed in states through bribes, through the Race to the Top legislation. The folks from Achieve told us that the Common Core Standards Initiative got underway before the Race to the Top was announced. I think he said that it got underway before the election in 2008, and Race to the Top was announced in July 2009. So I guess I'd like you to clarify, because I do keep hearing that. This is not the first time I've heard that, so I'd like you to clarify that. You mentioned about the standards not being field tested. Again, that's come up before, and I've been told that pretty much none of the standards are field tested. The Michigan standards that preceded the Common Core weren't field tested. So trying to figure out, why is this different than any other state standard? Do you field test it, or do you adopt it and then move on? Finally, you had said listen to your classroom teachers, and I'm doing a great deal of that, because I've heard from many of my teachers. I'm from here in Lansing, and they've actually come to these meetings, and I had teachers at the first hearing come up to me afterwards and talk to me about this, and they are very supportive of it. So I've asked them about the testing, and I've asked them about the implementation, and they do seem supportive of it. And we've got letters from the Michigan Education Association and the Michigan Associated Federation for Teachers, and they're all supportive. So it's interesting to hear your comments and say listen to your teachers, because they seem to be supportive. As I think about this, and I agree with you, everything is risky. Changing the standard is risky. It's always risky. But wouldn't it be, if you're talking about moving that 4-foot bar to 6 feet, don't we want our children to be able to get over that 6 feet bar in order to be more competitive nationally and internationally? So those are some of my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can repeat any of those if you need. There were 3 of them there.
All right, that's, let me go, I'm going to see if I can answer them and remember them all. The first is that it's true, Achieve has been working on developing national standards before 2009, but what they could have put out these standards, the Common Core standards, and maybe a few states would adopt them, maybe they wouldn't. The reason that 45 states adopted them is because when Race to the Top was announced, in order to be eligible for Race to the Top funding, states had to say that they had career and college-ready standards. Now, the only career and college-ready standards that were out there, there were no others other than Common Core. Everyone understood, all the states understood, that what Secretary Duncan meant was adopt the Common Core if you want to be eligible. There are states that adopted the Common Core before they were written, before they were finished. They weren't even, the states that were adopting them without seeing them. The State Commissioner of Education in Texas said that he was asked to sign on and they weren't finished and he hadn't seen them and he wouldn't do it. Many other states adopted them without having seen them. This would not have happened. There would not be today 45 states having adopted the Common Core without $4.35 billion in federal funding attached to, if you want to be eligible for the funding, you have to adopt them. So there's no question that the federal money was the bribe offered in order to go forward. Your second question was it about the one about teacher, about rigor? I believe in rigor, but we have a lot of kids who can't clear that 4-foot bar. Raise it to 6 feet, and you'll see that the top 10% will jump over that bar. You're going to see failure massive across the state of Michigan, and parents are going to say, what has happened? Why is my child, who was a B student, now a failing student? Do you think that everyone should fail unless they get an A? I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I went to an Ivy League college, like there was one guy who was the architect of the Common Core standards. He went to Harvard, he went to Oxford. That's really wonderful. But most of our kids are not going to Harvard. They're not going to Oxford. I think that the kids who are whether they're going to an Ivy League college, whether they're going to the University of Michigan, whether they're going to a community college, whether they're not going to go to college at all, should have a fair chance to get a high school diploma. And if you're going to deny a diploma to everyone unless they're an A student, we're going to ruin our education system, discourage students, and wreck our country's economy. So I think that's not a sensible thing to do. As for the teacher support, I think what we have to see over time is implementation in the classroom and get the feedback. Right now, there is no place where teachers who are actually using this can say this works or this doesn't work. I think that for political reasons, both the NEA and the AFT decided to endorse the standards. I don't think it's because they had seen how they work in the classroom. Again, if you just look at the practical experience, I'm a great believer in evidence. My training is a historian. I believe that you don't do things without having evidence. And when you say that the standards are going to make everyone in college and career ready, how do we know that? I mean, I could come into your town and have a big case filled with bottles filled with some substance and say to you, if you buy this, it will cure cancer. And then when you open up, you discover it's got snake oil in it. Well, I can make any claim for my snake oil, but that doesn't mean it's going to work. Right now, we're being told that these standards and these standards alone will make our children college and career ready, and we have no evidence that that's true. The biggest promoters of the standards today, aside from Secretary Duncan, are major corporations. I would challenge the heads of those corporations to take the Common Core test that was administered to 8th graders or 5th graders in New York State and publish their scores. I'd like to see how they do on the same test.
Thank you. Representative Rogers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned graduation rates improving, yet I'm conflicted there in that I have many teachers that are calling and saying they have no kids in the classroom, we're going to be assessing them, and they have no kids in middle school that are actually reading at grade level. Did you take into account how, or are we pushing some kids through the system? We may increase graduation rates, but it doesn't mean they're educated. You also mentioned, because I'm going to throw these out there so we can keep things moving along, Pearson, who not only writes the text, where do they get that information from? Who helps them in writing our texts? And then they turn around and get to write the test. So are they controlling education, or are we controlling it?
Well, Pearson is the largest test publisher in the world, and I can't begin to account for how many states they're writing tests for. I know that they have a $500 million contract with Texas. They have a $32 million in New York. They have millions and millions, if not $1 billion in contracts all over the country. I'm sure that some of the Common Core tests will be written by Pearson. The test writing is absolutely crucial. I guess that what concerns me is that I've reached an age where I can look back to my own schooling and remember a time when we didn't even take standardized tests. We didn't have the same graduation rates that we have today. Many kids dropped out because there were jobs for kids then that there are not today. But the value, think about what testing is all about. What we're testing today is to rank students, to rank teachers, to decide whether to hire or to keep or to fire teachers, and to rate schools. But that's not the purpose of testing. The purpose of testing is supposed to be as a diagnostic tool. Now, you don't use your thermometer when you take your temperature as a way of deciding whether or not to get bonus pay or whether or not to pay your doctor more. You don't take your temperature every hour or every day. You take your temperature to find out if you're well or if you need medicine, if you need help. Tests are supposed to be a diagnostic tool. The best way to be a diagnostic tool is if you get almost instant feedback. And that was the virtue of having teachers write their test and to be able to say, Johnny needs more time and attention in learning fractions. Mary needs more time on her spelling. This is how I'm going to help my students. What we're doing today, and this is not just true in Michigan but across the country, is we test the kids in the spring, the results come back in the summer, they don't even have the same teacher the next year, and no one is allowed to see the test questions, and no one's allowed to do the analysis of what the children learned and didn't learn. So we've completely lost the main purpose of testing, which is the diagnostic function of how do we help kids and how do we help teachers do a better job. Instead, we're using the test just as a way to punish and reward people, and that's the misuse of testing.
What's interesting, you mentioned that instant feedback, and I'm part of this component, though the computer adaptive test or just a computer test, which would give us that instant feedback into the classroom during a current year. Is that what you would be espousing in some fashion?
Well, I do think that the instant feedback or the feedback within a reasonable period of time, say a week, 10 days, it would be very helpful. I'm not fond of computer adaptive testing because I think that it reduces the possibility of really learning what kids can know and do. It limits the testing either to multiple choice questions, which are very limiting, and there are now computer adaptive questions where the tests are grading essays, and you can say ridiculous things, and if you say it in good English, it's okay. Facts don't matter in a computer adaptive test. You can say that the Civil War took place in 1712, and that'll be okay in a computer adaptive test because the computer can't recognize factual errors. It only recognizes the format of sentences and the structure of the paragraphs. So I have a lot of problems with computer adaptive testing. I believe in human judgment. I know that it's a fault these days to believe in human judgment, but I do.
Well, I'm one of those, I firmly believe in a growth model because I don't see that kids in various subjects personally can necessarily grow all at the same pace. And however we get to that point, that's where we have to emphasize. My understanding is the MEP does not do that here in the state of Michigan, at least according to all the educators that I speak with. But regardless, that's where I would like to see it. I happen to be, are you familiar with Unit STEP? Have you ever heard of that program?
What is that called?
Unit STEP.
I don't know that program now.
And most people probably don't. I was one of the guinea pigs, the only 4-year graduating class in the Unit STEP program, and an experiment. So that's probably why I'm sitting here with all of you folks. Algebra 2, another thing. I'm a firm believer in the voc ed part. But the one thing that does disturb me when you talk about even the Gates Foundation, whether it's Gates or Dow or anybody else, is that are you suggesting then, when I have to sit through the various committees and all of the different foundations that participate, maybe what you're suggesting is we just eliminate anybody allowing any foundation to fund any kind of research, because I can't just pick on Gates, I would have to pick on Kresge, I would have to pick on, say, Dow, and all these multitude of things. So there's always a lineage across the board in almost any issue that we have before us, whether it's education or transportation or anything else. Somebody is funding a study. And so I find it a little bit disingenuous when we try to focus on one such just because they are. I can do that with every single issue. So that's just a point.
Let me just say about the foundations. I'm all in favor of foundations supporting public schools, supporting research, supporting studies. What has concerned me, and I wrote about this in my last book, is that we now have 3 huge foundations, multi-billion-dollar foundations, that choose an agenda, and they know what they want, and their studies all confirm what they want. They don't fund studies that come out with results other than what they want. The Gates Foundation decided 12 years ago that we needed small schools, and it spent $2 billion breaking up large high schools into small schools, and then in 2008 Bill Gates decided that didn't work, and he just dropped it. And then he decided the problem was we have bad teachers, and so the focus had to be on teacher evaluation. And all the research now supports his belief that teacher evaluation is the key. Let me suggest a completely different model, which is I don't believe that teachers should be evaluated by the test scores of their students. I'm very impressed with a program out of Montgomery County, Maryland, called Peer Assistance and Review. Under Peer Assistance and Review, every new teacher gets a mentor who's an experienced teacher, and the mentor works with the new teacher. And after a year or two, the mentor reports to a committee made up of teachers and principals and supervisors and recommends that the teacher either be accepted or asked or get more help or leave the profession. Teachers who have gotten poor evaluations from their principals and teachers with tenure who've gotten poor evaluations will also get a mentor. In the same process, the mentor helps that teacher, helps them improve, and after a year goes to the committee and says, committee, this teacher has made it, we should definitely keep him or her, or this teacher can't be helped, won't be helped, he should be removed, she should be fired. And that program of Peer Assistance and Review, which is professional, which relies on human judgment, which does not rely on test scores, has been very successful. More than 200 teachers have been removed from the profession from Montgomery County, Maryland, and it has tremendous support amongst the teachers there, and it works. It's a very successful program. I've also been impressed when I went to visit Finland not long ago, and there, where they have the quality control, is the intake of teachers. Teachers have to be highly, highly prepared in order to join the profession. They have 5 years of education. They apply to become teachers right out of high school and then go into a rigorous teacher training program. There are 10 applicants for every place entering teaching, because teaching is such a highly respected profession. And after 5 years, they become teachers, and they have no standardized testing in Finland because their teachers are so good that they're trusted. The system understands that if the teacher says the student needs more time and more help, they get more time and more help. They have a lot of intervention, a lot of support for the kids, and Finland's one of the highest performing nations in the world on the international test, without any standardized testing.
And I appreciate you bringing up Finland, saved me from starting that part of the conversation. And I understand that they pay for a 3-year advanced degree for those, but in the same breath, they only take the top 10% to put into the program. And we would have to consider that we will only take that top 10% if we are going to advance and even cover that cost. And that's a discussion we actually have been having, and I have been having with colleagues, but everybody tends to forget that part of the component, said let's go to Finland and emulate that. But that's how they actually factor it, is the 10% rule, and then they'll pay for the 3-year.
Actually, in Finland, all higher education is free to the student. No one pays, the government pays, but the government's attitude is that education is a basic human right. So no one pays for any education, not for professional education, college education, or any other kind of education. All education is free. As I mentioned before, the teaching is such a highly respected profession that there are 10 applicants for every place in the teacher education programs, and only 1 out of 10 is accepted. So yes, it is highly selective, and it's highly selective because it's respected. There's professional autonomy. The judgment of teachers is respected, and they're not being beat up on the way they are in this country.
Representative O'Brien.
Thank you. I was very interested in your conversation about the research that you've done looking at testing over the years. My question to you is, if 20 plus years ago somebody scored, let's say, like a 27, 28 on an ACT, would that person in today's ACT test have that same score? So I'm not sure how expectations have changed, and are we comparing apples to apples?
Well, I wasn't looking at ACT scores, but at the NAEP scores. And NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the federal testing program, has been testing American students since 1970. They've been testing in both reading and in math, some other subjects as well, but regularly in reading and math. And over the long term, over those past 40 plus years, the scores have gone up steadily and significantly in reading, dramatically in mathematics. And yes, that is a consistent measure. There are 2 different kinds of forms of this test, the national test. One is called the long-term trend. The progress had been dramatic up until 2008, and when the report came out just a few weeks ago, progress literally came to a halt from 2008 to 2012. So all of the billions we're now investing in high-stakes testing has produced no improvement at all.
Thank you.
Representative Verheulen, last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Doctor, for your testimony. I just wanted to, for purposes of my question, kind of separate the testing questions or the testing issue from the standards themselves. And if I heard your statement, I think you said something to the effect of, listen to the teachers, let them use the standard for a couple of years and try to improve. Is that a fair characterization of what you said?
Yes.
Okay, so I have been talking to the teachers in my district, and they are in the process and have been in designing their curriculum to mesh with the standard. And what they've been saying, and I don't want to generalize, but they've basically been saying, yeah, this standard is superior to the previous standard. So I think what you're saying to us is let them continue to go down that path, see how, what their reaction is, and improve it as we go forward. Is that fair?
Yes, and I also said that it's very important that you retain the power to make the improvements, and don't assume that you have to get the NGA or Achieve's approval, because they have no power over you.
Yep.
You're the sovereign state of Michigan, and if you decide in your wisdom that the standards can be made better, then make them better. If you decide that some of it is developmentally inappropriate, as I believe the early grades are, then listen to your teachers on that. Where I would urge you to go slow is with the testing.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravitch. Thank you for your time, and good luck with your book.
Thank you.
Next up, we're going to have, if you wouldn't mind, if Dr. Evers and perhaps Sandra Stotsky, if you just both want to come up at the same time, and we'll begin with Dr. William Evers of the Hoover Institute. Oh, I'm sorry. Williams Evers. Thank you.
I'm Williamson Evers of the Hoover Institution, where I'm a research fellow. I was a member of the California State Academic Standards Commission in 2010 when the Common Core National Curriculum Content Standards were under consideration. I was on the National Educational Research Policy and Priorities Board of the federal government. I ran the school system in Iraq in 2003. I was U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education for Policy in from 2007 to 2009. I'd like to start out by saying something about what the Common Core is. So these are a list of topics to be the curriculum content for all these schools, these 45 or so states. And we're talking about math and English, but to that has now been added science. And there is associated testing, federally funded testing, and there is associated data collection. So there's quite a bit of collection of the data from the tests, and it's then associated with other data collected by the states and the federal government. So it has been pointed out by your business leaders that this was not the testing. The Common Core goes from before the race to the top, before the Obama administration. This is correct. It goes back to 2006 when a couple of think tanks started working on this. They later enlisted, this was Bob Wise's Educational Alliance, and it was the Hunt Institute, and they later enlisted other people like Achieve, and then the Governors Association, the lobbying arm of the governors, and the lobbying arm of the state school superintendents. The federal government didn't participate until it started these bribes or inducements or whatever, coercing the states into adopting the Common Core. And the federal government has been involved in things like this before. In 1917, back in the Woodrow Wilson administration, sort of like the Gates Foundation, the Phelps-Stokes Foundation wrote a report on why African Americans should not have an academic education, and the federal government promoted this, published it, sponsored conferences on it, and so forth, so that all across the South, blacks were not given an academic education. We have had the Governors Association and the chief state school officers also involved. They were involved in the George H.W. Bush effort at national standards. In the case of the Governors Association, you can all remember it may be the Charlottesville Summit and the deep involvement of the Governors Association in that. In the case of the chief state school officers, they were subcontractors of the Clinton era effort at national standards. Both these efforts at national standards, of course, precipitously collapsed. Now, what exactly is going on here? They list the topics, but they also can, and in the case of Common Core, do include detailed prescriptions of how to teach in the classroom. Now, you had testimony from two of your business representatives that this, how to teach in the classroom, is going to be left to local districts and schools. But that is all too often not the case. Let me give you some examples. In the case of similar and congruent triangles, which is a major topic that's pervasive throughout geometry, and many of you may not use this in your daily life, but somewhere in the back of your mind, angle, side, angle. Side, angle, side. This may resonate with you, and you could learn it again if you had to. Well, the Common Core is not going to teach it this way. It prescribes for teachers a thing called rigid motion, which has never been used successfully in K-12 education in the United States. Not in any state, not in any county, or not in any school district, not in any city. It's never been used, but it's being imposed all across the country. Student-invented algorithms. A lot of bad history with that, but that's right there. Lots of talk about related matters of strategies, problem solving, loose language about problem solving and strategies that leads to non-standard algorithms in these Common Core line textbooks that we're now seeing. So for example, in the Pearson math textbook, you see when you take multiple digit subtraction and addition, so you think of the multiple digit, you stack them, and normally you would start in the ones column and borrow or carry numbers, depending on whether you were doing addition or subtraction. Well, in the Pearson books, they start in the hundreds column. This is a non-standard algorithm. This is something parents are not going to really be familiar with, and teachers are not going to be familiar with. So Pearson is prescribing doing this because they think this is in concert with the Common Core's desire for problem solving. Now, there were also serious errors. So when it comes to long and short vowels in the primary grades and the teaching of reading, there's a mistake that got in there. Well, they have no way to correct this mistake. In math, when it comes to testing the hypothesis of equality among sample means, the method that the Common Core prescribes is just frankly outright wrong. There is no way. This is copywritten. This is set in stone. My friend, Dr. Ravitch, says, well, you just modify it. You guys have signed a contract with the National Governors Association and the Chief State School Officers that says, we're taking the whole thing, we can't change anything, we can add 15%. Now, if you do that and you violate that contract, you may have consequences. I think you're stuck with it. When it comes to another important point of autonomy of curriculum control, remember that the testing is going to determine what the teachers teach. Now, Linda Darling-Hammond, who is the principal brains behind Smarter Balance, which is the testing regime that you guys have signed up with, Michigan has signed up with and is a major participant in, has said very frankly in interviews that she wants to change the way all teaching is done in the United States. She wants progressive education, and you can have progressive education. Mr. Yonker had it for his children in his school, a variety of it. But I don't think really it should be dictated to every district and every school in the state of Michigan. And yet she is deliberately designing these tests to be project-based, to be performance-based and so forth, so as to impose progressive education on all the states that are part of Smarter Balance. Don't think, by the way, that Michigan is going to be setting the cut scores. That was part of what was being discussed with regard to the results in Kentucky and in New York State. Smarter Balance is going to be setting the cut scores. There's a deep question here pertaining to competitive federalism, and I think all of you who revere our constitutional system and what the United States has been able to do in terms of being a distinctive and exceptional country should consider this. Federalism is not only the distinction and rivalry between the federal government and the states, but it's also the rivalry among the states themselves and among local governments within the states. So someone who studied this, Richard McKenzie, writes, the founders sought to disperse power among many different and competing governments at the federal, state, and local levels. I'm ending that quote now. So the insight of competitive federalism is that 51 state school boards are better than a single federal executive branch office. 15,000 local school boards are better than either 51 state school boards or a single federal office. So having this competitive federalism means that there is rivalry, there is competition among the states and the districts to the benefit of all the citizens of the country. You better match voter preferences, you better match where that state or district is. You can have innovation that you can't have if there's a monopoly. Now, your business representatives said that they were internationally benchmarked, but I just have to disagree. If you listen to the only mathematician who was one of the people writing the math standards, William McCollum of the University of Arizona, professor of mathematics, here's what he told a group of research mathematicians. I was there in the room. He could not have been clearer. These standards are not high. Certainly not in comparison with other nations, including East Asia, where math education excels. His exact words, I was there in the room. So these are not internationally benchmarked. That's just a sales comment that they've actually withdrawn from their website. They no longer say it. They just say they were informed by practices in other countries. Now, and as was also mentioned by by Representative McMillan, your state standards in Michigan are better, as judged by the Fordham Institute, a proponent of Common Core, than the Common Core math standards themselves. If you want to get out, you have to remember that this is a bit like a Venus flytrap. The farther you get in, the harder it is, especially the harder it is politically to get out. But you can get out. We can look back in history. There was, after the Sputnik was launched in the late 1950s, the federal government promoted a series of national curriculum methods, and most famously maybe the new math. All the publishers, all the K-12 textbook publishers had new math. Within a few years, it collapsed. Goals 2000 of the Clinton administration had 48 states. Within a few years, it collapsed, and the test items that were written were given over to the NAEP test. The New Standards Project of the 1990s, roughly is somewhat the same period as that Clinton effort, had 22 states. Within a few years, it collapsed. So these things can wind down. Some of us are old enough to remember the Jerry Ford administration's statement that we would all be on the metric system, and that all the schools would only teach in the metric system within a few years. And so these things can change. I think in terms of whatever might have been invested, I think we could draw an analogy from the automotive industry. Suppose you were a company building automobiles, and supposing you were a Ford Motor Company, and supposing you built something called the Edsel, and supposing it didn't work out very well. You could do one of two things. You could get out of it and retool your resources, put your people in a different job and role. You could put your equipment, the part that could be reassigned to a different job and role. Or you could double down, you could keep producing more and more Edsels and keep the line in operation. So I think you should consider what would be best for the children in Michigan, and not any previous activities, but what looking forward would be best. I wanted to make a few comments further. The first is, one of the business representatives said that we need to look at where the good jobs are, and the states that we're competing with, Michigan is competing with, are all going to be in the Common Core. Well, what about Texas? Isn't that sort of the job engine of the United States right now? Texas is the powerhouse. Texas is refusing to be in Common Core. It thinks that it can do much better outside of Common Core. So if you don't feel you're competing with Texas, okay, go ahead. Mr. Rothwell said that America had been near the top decades ago, not too many decades ago, but we're now at the bottom. Well, actually, that's not really the case. We've been mediocre quite a long time. Going back to the 1970s, we have the tests for TIMS, which are an international test on science and mathematics, and we were mediocre back then, and so was Canada. Canada has risen to the advanced level and is doing much better than the United States. The United States has stayed flat in mediocre. Canada, interestingly enough, has no national office or ministry or Department of Education. It has no national standards. Now, some people will say, well, other countries that are better than the United States have national standards. Well, that's true. Also, almost all countries that are worse than the United States have national standards. We are an exceptional country. We are a different country. We have a lot of decentralization. We have this form of competitive federalism to allow innovation and allow freedom of movement to different jurisdictions to try something different. If you do everything the same everywhere in the country, you block that path for innovation.
Thank you. Sandra? Dr. Stotsky?
It's all right. Sandra is my name. That's fine. Am I? Fine. Thank you very much. Let me tell you my background briefly. I have had the privilege of speaking before a committee not just a few months ago in Michigan, and I will be building on many of the comments that I made in my remarks at that hearing. I was a senior associate commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from '99 to 2003, and there I was in charge of developing or revising the state's K-12 standards in all major subjects, licensing regulations for teachers and administrators, teacher licensure tests, and professional development criteria. I'm emphasizing that this time because I am going to make the point, as I also made several months ago, that in our talk about standards, we are really missing the basic problem, which is our schools of education. I'm not going to talk about them here, but that is where the problem is located, and unless we begin with drastic reforms of our schools of education, it really isn't going to make any difference ultimately how much we do with our standards. It will make some differences, and this is what I will talk about. It will make some differences for what happens at the college level. And that is the area that I'm going to focus on after I just indicate a few other things that I've done in my background. I have reviewed standards for the Fordham Institute for many years. I also co-authored Achieve's American Diploma Project High School Exit Test Standards. That's a mouthful, but I was involved working under Mike Cohen at the time on what was a very promising project that had quite a few states interested in developing high school exit standards, and I was the one involved with the English standards. Finally, and this is where I am bouncing off for many of my remarks, I served on Common Core's Validation Committee from 2009 to 2010. I was one of about 25 or so members of a very frustrating committee. Our charge was to ensure that the standards being produced by Common Core were internationally benchmarked, rigorous, research-based, process was transparent, some other criteria, but those were the main ones. And I was one of the 5 people who could not sign off on this set of criteria because the standards were not internationally benchmarked, they were not research-based, and they were not rigorous. Not only did I not sign off, but so also did the only mathematician, not mathematics educator, but mathematician on the committee. He also refused to sign off. I was the only English language arts standards expert on the committee. Now, that was maybe one major clue to what has been wrong, and this was alluded to in Dr. Ravitch's earlier remarks about the development of these standards. One would have expected the standards to have been developed by whom? They're called college readiness standards. Who would be the 2 groups of people you would think common sense should be involved in developing college readiness standards? Ask anyone and they will tell you the people who teach college freshmen and high school math and English teachers. And those were the 2 groups that were basically not on the Standards Development Committee, nor were they on the Validation Committee. I had to ask for at least one high school English teacher to be on the Validation Committee because I thought it looked peculiar to be validating something that most of us had absolutely no experience with. My comments are going to be grouped around 3 basic focuses. First of all, I'm going to tell you why Common Core standards are not rigorous, and I'll confine my remarks to the English language arts, which is my area of expertise, why they do not make students ready for a high school diploma, never mind authentic college coursework. And those are 2 distinct academic levels that have been fudged by Common Core, and I want to point that out again. I'm also going to explain briefly why Common Core standards lack a research base, international benchmarking, and credible authors. And then I have several recommendations to make. And I'm going to start off actually with one of the recommendations because I have listened very carefully to what the business leaders said at the beginning, and I recall having spoken about this at many other state legislative hearings where I have been invited over the past 6 months. I've been in well over a dozen states, speaking to state legislators who do not understand what Common Core is and what college readiness means. And their state boards of education that adopted Common Core standards obviously did not understand what college readiness meant either. Why do I say that? Because not one state, not one, including Michigan, including Massachusetts, where I was on the Board of Education for 4 years, not one state Board of Education, not one state legislature has asked its own higher ed people, faculty in engineering, science, and math, to look at the college readiness math standards in Common Core and advise the Board of Education and the legislature whether these standards constitute college readiness for their institutions. I still don't understand it. I don't understand why business organizations, why major industries, who can detail the problems which we all agree we do not have the kind of workforce we need. We do not have enough students going into math and science, majors and graduate programs in this country. We know what the problems are. We all agree with them. I know I have spoken to engineering faculty at Northeastern University. All of their graduate students come from other countries. Not one American student in Northeastern's graduate programs in engineering. There is something basically wrong everywhere, not just in Massachusetts alone, obviously, because they draw from the entire country. Why didn't we hear from the people who teach college freshmen about whether Common Core's standards in mathematics or in English might be appropriate for their institutions? I don't know why business didn't do that. You would think they would have done that in their own states. You have plenty of experts here. Every state has major universities. Michigan has one of the best in the country. How come the 3 major universities in Michigan were not asked what they thought of the college readiness standards? Let me just briefly go through why I think they are not rigorous, and I give evidence. You've all had my paper distributed, and I've said an awful lot on websites that are available for anyone to look at. First of all, most of Common Core's ELA, college readiness and grade level reading standards, are content-free skills. You cannot get rigor from a skill. You get rigor from content. And there is almost no content in Common Core's English language arts standards. It is rather indifferent to content in general. You may think that you're getting more science content from Achieve's latest next generation science standards, but I think you ought to take a look at the review by scientists of even Achieve's proposed national science standards. High school chemistry has almost disappeared. Now, does that make for a more rigorous high school curriculum? What do college level folks say about it? We haven't asked them. I don't know why. So that is a problem when you deal with skills. Secondly, and this has been in the newspapers because it was the one issue that reporters seemed to be able to grasp, Common Core's English language teachers expects English language arts teachers to spend over 50% of their reading instructional time at every grade level on informational texts. This is a percentage from which students cannot benefit intellectually. There's no research to support such a shift. This is not what English teachers themselves ever approved of as a group. And it is there when you look at the English language arts standards. There have been a lot of, let me call it forked tongue language. You have people saying, oh, but the standards allow English teachers to focus on literary study. And then you look at the document, and it has 10 standards for informational text, 9 standards for literature, K to 12. Sorry, that amounts to about 50-50. There is no way any English teacher can, if they're following the standards, and most superintendents and state departments of education are telling them that they should have about 50% of one and 50% of the other. So you can't concentrate on literary study. Now, some people will say, oh, why does that matter? Do carpenters need to have read Shakespeare? This is a common response I have found. And the question is, where do you develop critical thinking, and why shouldn't we have the same educational aspirations for all children? Wouldn't we want them to have the same musical education, artistic education, as well as for any other area? Literature is one of the arts and has been the center, the content of the English program in most countries. The language and literature of their country is the center of their particular language curriculum, K to 12. Why should we change it to 50% information when there is no information that the English teacher has ever been responsible for teaching? So you have this focus and this shift. 50% is there from K to 12. It's right there if you look at the number of standards. You don't have to listen to a forked tongue that says, oh, well, we expect the teachers in the other subjects to teach more information. Yes, they should be teaching more in history, more in science, more in math. But that doesn't change what the standards seem to mandate English teachers to do, unless you decide you don't want to go along with what Common Core is going to do. Whether this is what's on the reading test, we don't know yet. So we have a third problem. Common Core reduces opportunities for students to develop critical thinking because for the most part it comes from teachers in the English class teaching kids how to read between the lines. That isn't what happens with science textbooks or history textbooks. Their kids are being taught to read the information in their textbooks. The textbooks aren't written so cleverly that you've got to read between the lines to figure out what the science is that you're being taught. That's not part of a science textbook, usually. Then we have two other points that I'll mention very quickly. Common Core's standards stress writing more than reading at every grade level, which is to the detriment of every subject in the curriculum. Here I speak as an expert because I studied reading research, reading instruction. That was my graduate work. And we know that writing follows reading. Reading should be about twice as much as writing in any class, in any English classroom or reading classroom, not the opposite. Writing is dependent upon good reading, not the opposite. Finally, this picks up something that Dr. Ravitch said. Common Core's writing standards are developmentally inappropriate and at many grade levels. Her focus was on the elementary grades, the early grades. My focus is on the high school grades. And that's why I'm interested in the college readiness issue. And that was why I was concerned as a member of the validation committee about why Common Core standards lack a research base, lack international benchmarking, and lack credible authors. One of the things we should have had in this country, if we were going to have national standards, is people with academic credentials and experience in the schools so that they would have credibility as authorities. In the English language arts, we ended up, we don't know why, because we have never seen any formal explanation of why we ended up with David Coleman and Susan Pimentel, neither of whom has ever taught in K-12, neither of whom has ever taught in higher education. How could they determine a college readiness level? They have no basis themselves. Neither has ever written about English language arts curriculum instruction. Neither has any reputation in the field of reading or literary study. How did they get chosen? Who chose them? Why? It's a mystery. But one would wonder that maybe the fact that they had no expertise would explain why some bizarre ideas have appeared in what has been recommended to English teachers. And I don't use that word lightly. Anyone who suggests to English teachers that they should teach historical documents cold has a very bizarre idea of educational learning and teaching. What is a cold reading of a historical document? It means you read a historical document devoid of its historical context. This is nonsense. But has anyone said it's nonsense? No. We don't find anyone daring to say the emperor has no clothes on. This is a serious problem in this country. So let me repeat these few facts before I go into the recommendations, which I will be very quick about. Common Core standards are not rigorous. They were designed to allow low-performing grade 11 students to enroll in credit-bearing courses in a non-selective college. That is the purpose of a college readiness set of standards. I don't think you have ever discussed it, but you should. What is the purpose of a set of standards called college readiness, and what do the college folks have to say about that? And what will it do to your freshman and maybe sophomore courses? Second, they're not internationally benchmarked, and no matter how many times I asked for the names of countries that we were supposedly benchmarked with, never could get one when I was on validation committee. There is no research to support Common Core stress on writing instead of reading, and there is no research to support Common Core stress on informational reading instead of literary study in the English class. There's no research to suggest the value of cold reading of historical documents, and most available research suggests exactly the opposite of what Common Core's English language arts standards seem to promote in the classroom. So, first recommendation, Michigan should eliminate appropriations to its Department of Education to implement the Common Core. Pause it, stop it, examine it, and get your people from higher ed, which I will talk a little bit more about in a second. It should withdraw from SBAC, Smarter Balance, and base its state assessments on its own previous standards. Your math standards before were better. Your English standards could always be readopted and beefed up if they seem to be lacking in the eyes of people in the state of Michigan. But it certainly would be a waste of taxpayers' money to base your state assessments on a set of standards that needs to be completely revised, if not abandoned. There are plenty of others out there that were much better. Only Common Core didn't start with any of them. Indiana's, Massachusetts's, and California's were better. That's where Common Core could have started and made us even more competitive, but it didn't. Michigan should also distinguish high school tests for a high school diploma from matriculation tests for admission to its colleges and universities. And I want you to seriously think about the development of matriculation exams. They are used in many European countries, including Finland. The idea that Finland doesn't have any standardized tests is an erroneous notion. It has a matriculation exam. If you want to get into its universities, and this is true for many other countries, not all, but many others, you have to pass a test that allows you to be considered by a particular department in the university. You have wonderful universities in this state. I know that because I went to the University of Michigan. You could have a matriculation exam developed by your own universities. What do they want Michigan high school students to know for admission to your own universities? Why do you need a Washington bureaucrat to tell you? Why do you need anybody outside of the state of Michigan to tell you what your high school students should know if they want to get into your own state or public universities? I frankly don't understand that lapse. You could ask your own engineering, science, and math faculty to devise the math portion of a matriculation exam. Ask your own literary and humanities scholars, and you have plenty of them, to devise the reading and literary part of it. And then this would follow something that you also heard on Diane Ravitch's little talk. All state standards should be reviewed and revised every 5 to 7 years by Michigan teachers, discipline-based experts in the arts and science, and parents. I liked her focus on teachers, but you need to go beyond grade school teachers. You've got to include higher ed experts because that's where college readiness goes. And you've got to include parents because ultimately they pay the bills. And I think what Bill Gates didn't understand is that it's the parents who vote with their feet. And you need to have parents involved in what their children's education is, regardless of what kind of parents they are. So those are my parting words, and I wish you well, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you both for your testimony. I want to remind the committee that we also have still the state board to hear from, as well as some public comment. So I would ask your questions accordingly. I would start, however, Dr. Stotsky, that you mentioned several times about asking higher ed what they thought. Whether or not they were asked or not, they support Common Core, the adoption here in Michigan through the President's Council. So my assumption is that they were asked, they were reviewed, or otherwise they wouldn't have said yes to the Common Core.
Who said yes, the presidents or the
President's
faculty?
Council.
Did the math faculty?
The President's Council.
Okay. The presidents, as I know in Massachusetts, because I was on the state board, and this was an issue I raised there too, the presidents do not actually speak necessarily. They do speak authoritatively, but they don't speak for their math faculty who teach these courses. And it's the math faculty who teach freshman math whom we need to hear from, and that every state needs to hear from. The presidents, unfortunately, are speaking for their universities, and it's become a politicized problem. They are not asking their math faculty, which rarely knows what's going on, because I've asked math professors whether their own president knows anything about what they do and what Common Core is, and they can't answer. And the English faculty. So the President's Council is not the right council, just as I would not ask schools of education to comment on the content of math standards at the high school level.
Thank you. Representative Price?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering, Dr. Stotsky, if you can help me. From what I understood from Dr. Ravitch's comments, she intimated that the Common Core standards are, the bar is set too high. Kids will not perform well. What I understand from you is that the standards are not rigorous enough. So I'm...
Okay, let me explain. When she said the bar was high, she was referring to the New York State tests. And that was, I think, if you listen to her comments again, she repeated several times that the cut score on the New York State tests, and this is an observation that has been made in the past week as people have been analyzing it, they used a very high cut score, and the cut score is the problem. The standards themselves, I don't think she was referring to, but you would have to listen again. I am talking to the quality of what is being demanded in the standards themselves and what the content of the standards are. I don't believe she was talking about the content of the standards. And I'm talking about the college readiness, high school level, and she was talking about elementary school. That was the basic difference.
Representative Kniezek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple quick questions. We've had the folks that are supporting, come before us and sort of lay out very similar reasons as to why, we want to hold everybody to higher standards. We want to get our students ready to fill the jobs, whether it's career, technical, whatever it is. And then we have, some of the opposition groups come up and, well, we don't need it because it's too rigorous. So it's going to increase the gap. We don't want it because it's not rigorous whatsoever. We focus too much on writing. We're not teaching enough handwriting. And so, we've talked about that higher ed piece and, the President's Council, and again, I heard what you just said, but all of the public universities that we have in Michigan support this. And all of the mathematician organizations across the country support this as well, which is interesting because traditionally they would, sort of push back against some of the standards. And so I think that sort of fulfills the concern you have about, experts in the field having concerns about this. And so, I don't want to be condescending, but we've got all these groups that are saying it's right, it's right, it's right, it's right. And we've got 4 folks who are on the validation committee who said it's wrong. So should we be listening to you 4 folks that say this is wrong, or should we listen to everybody else who agree?
No, I think you need to listen to your own faculty. And this is what I keep saying over and over again. Instead of listening to the presidents of universities all over the country, I don't care whether they're in Michigan or in Massachusetts or elsewhere, listen to your own mathematics, engineering, and science faculty in your own universities. I don't know who they are. I know one of them here at Michigan State University, Thomas Parker, who probably isn't that far away. He's a professor of mathematics, and he teaches prospective elementary teaches mathematics, and he probably teaches other courses. Those for undergraduates, those are the people you want to hear. I've known about these letters to the associations in mathematics all over the country and how they were signed on. Most of these people, I can assure you, never even looked at the math standards. But whether they did or not, the question to me is, do your own math, science, and engineering faculty and your English and humanities professors who teach freshmen in your own major universities, do they know what Common Core is about? Do they know that students who are deemed college ready on a grade 11 test can take credit-bearing courses in the freshman year? I mean, that's where I would be looking in every state. I couldn't get that even in Massachusetts, and I kept screaming about why we can't hear from our own faculty in Massachusetts. They didn't know anything about Common Core. That's where you want to go.
Sir, so one of your problems is one set of people are saying this will improve things a lot, and another set of people are questioning it. This actually reminds me of Representative Yonker's question that he asked the last panel, which had to do with, well, we had this program in Michigan, and people said that that was going to improve things, and now we're saying, well, the magic sauce is the national program, and he was expressing some skepticism. Interestingly, Brookings Institution's education researcher Tom Lovelace looked at precisely this question of Mr. Yonkers that you echoed in a sense. And so that was whether Common Core will boost student achievement. And he concluded, Tom Lovelace concluded, there will be little or no impact on how much children learn. So he uses California as an example, but you can reflect on how much this echoes on Michigan. So California has had state curriculum framework since 1962. It had statewide testing with scores for every school published publicly since 1971. It had state K-8 textbooks since the 19th century, textbook adoption. And it had court-ordered equalized spending since the late 1970s. So he says, any effect that standards-based policy might have had on decreasing the variation within California has already happened. Every state, including Massachusetts and Mississippi, has high-performing districts and schools within it and low-performing. So Michigan has its Mississippi within it, and it has its Massachusetts within it already. Little mini Massachusetts, little mini Mississippis. So the question is the range of learning going to come together and go up or not? And he says the range of variation, the variation will go untouched by the Common Core. You have already had whatever gains you're going to capture from state-based standards that you already have. You will not get further gains from the Common Core. This money is wasted. That's me, not him, the last part.
Representative Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Realizing that you focused on college, what about career-ready, vocational ed? Can you comment on that in regard to this particular issue?
Yes, and I'm sorry I didn't actually get to a statement that I would have made about vocational technical schools, because they turned out to be this hidden gem in Massachusetts, and it's not clear what is going to happen to them under Common Core. The current Secretary of Education, Duncan, doesn't like vocational technical schools. So far, I don't think he can touch the Perkins money that's allotted to them, but he wants to see, and this seems to be the whole part of the motivation behind Common Core, is to have grade-by-grade testing, cohorts kept together. And actually, one of the major ways to improve and strengthen education in this country is by offering a range of alternative high schools. And the vocational technical schools are one of the many kinds of options that we should be giving high school students, 14 or 15-year-olds. This is what Europe does. They offer, after grade 8 or 9, a range of choices for high schools. We need vocational technical schools far more than we have them. I don't know the extent to which they are a strong network here in Michigan, but they are, the students who apply for them in Massachusetts, there are now waiting lists for them. Their parents know the value of them. And it is unfortunate for them to be ignored. What Duncan and his followers seem to want is for vocational technical training to take place after high school. This is 4 years later than what happens in Europe. They go in after grade 8 or 9. It isn't as if Duncan, etc., think that everyone can go to college. So you're going to have your post-secondary technical institutes, but in other countries, and they have to be choices. It can't be that you dump kids in these schools. Massachusetts was very careful about making sure that they couldn't be dumping grounds as they once were 50 years ago. That was when they developed a very negative reputation. So you have to have criteria for admission to them that make sense for these schools, certain levels of reading and writing. And you have to have other options, and I've talked about high schools of performing arts, for music, language high schools. There is a whole range we could do in this country that can exist. And we haven't thought in those terms. We've had this very narrow focus on standards and testing for all kids in lockstep fashion. And I can't seem to get a broader vision of actually what was even implicit in some of Achieve's early work, which I liked, where they got from employers, what kinds of different standards they had, what coursework, what background would be needed for different kinds of jobs that were out there in the market. We just haven't done that enough in this country, and that area needs to be developed far more with apprenticeships than it has been, and it's not there in Common Core. It will damage it.
Typically, it's post K-12. Does Massachusetts, did they do a dual enrollment similar to we have?
No, they go after grade 8.
After grade 8?
They have counseling, and it's a 9 to 12 regional high school. There are 30 of them across the state. 30 of them. Now, I don't know what you have here, but it's 9 to 12. So it's an alternate high school, but they can go on to college because they've taken the same basic subjects with the same level of cut score that kids in regular high schools take. So there's no problem with their going on if they want to go to a liberal arts college afterwards.
Thank you.
I just wanted to concur with Professor Stotsky on this vocational ed and alternative high schools thing, but also to say, and also concur with her point not to let it be a dumping ground, but to mention that Singapore has quite a good program of academically excellent vocational education.
Thank you. Last question, Representative McMillan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given all that you've said, I'm surprised that other members of the committee aren't interested in challenging you, so I guess they're accepting your premises. So I guess what you're saying is that the validation committee was pretty much a sham. The standards aren't very good. Now, some would say that, like Dr. Ravitch said, they might be too confusing or maybe too rigorous in the, when dealing with first grade and prepositions or things like that. Other areas, like in math and some of the other literature areas, it's not very high at all. It takes away state and local control. They weren't piloted. They are very experimental. They're likely to widen the gap between the rich and poor, the minority and non-minority. They're developmentally inappropriate. Much of it was funded by one person as far as the studies and the advocacy groups and the development, and that the testing, high-stakes testing, is federally funded. So I guess we're pretty much on the committee taking those as truth and premise. Otherwise, I would have assumed we'd hear some pushback. But one of the things I tried to get at earlier in another committee that I couldn't was the structure of the NGA. And I think with Dr. Ravitch, it was misinterpreted. She wasn't saying adopt the Common Core and see how it goes. She was saying there may be good things there, but you want to make sure it was clear to retain the ability to change them, as there's plenty of errors in these things. There's plenty of inappropriate things regarding prepositions or whatever the structure of the standards. So they're going to need to be changed, you need to hear from your teachers, and that is something that's not going to be able to be done. And Dr. Stotsky, I guess I wanted to ask about the NGA, because we, in my opinion, have turned over the standards to a private entity, a trade association, and you have some workings with them and with the chief with regard to this validation committee. So trying to figure out when we see things that are horribly bad, that our teachers saying this isn't working in the standard, there's some notion that we're going to be able to go to the NGA and they're going to say, oh, Michigan, you think it needs to be changed? It's confusing for your kids? Well, we'll change it, no problem. Do you know, and that it's going to be transparent, that we're going to be able to, know all the workings that go on, that we're going to have a vote, or that we're going to have a say. It sounds to me like there's people in the NGA behind closed doors that are going to be making these decisions. And, we can say our kids are being harmed by these maybe 2 or 3 or 1 year after implementing them, but we're still going to have to teach them. This stuff is still going to be on the test. And what is this group some big open group that's gonna make sure they're very flexible and do whatever states want, or is it going to be something that these high academics feel need to be done, and that's the way it's going to go?
The problem is going to be you won't know what's going on behind the scenes because it's removed from the states, and it's in the hands of 2 NGOs, private organizations, that consist of revolving members, the chief members, governors, and those who are in CCSSO, which would be your chief, your superintendents of education or your commissioners of education. They come and go. They're rotating all the time. So it's their staff. It's like the old comments they used to make about the French Revolution comes and goes, but the civil service is determining everything that's going on, because those are the people who stay in place. And this is what seems to be happening. Whoever is the CEO in these organizations and whatever staff they hire will be responding as ever they will to whatever the states bring to them. But how they respond, what they want to do, what procedures they follow, they will just simply make up ad hoc, because they're not a civic body. I've been a member of a number of civic bodies in my life, and there are strict sunshine laws, minutes of meetings, rules and procedures you have to follow. They set their own. So it's not clear what they would do if any state said, we think these math standards are simply inappropriate for what we want in our state, for admission to our universities or whatever. But there's no mechanism in place, and we don't know how that mechanism will ever get there.
So I want to associate myself also with Professor Stotsky's remarks about the 2 trade associations. I just wanted to make an addendum to your point about gaps and problems with people that come from educationally strong backgrounds in their families and some educationally weak, and maybe that the gaps would get worse, the academic achievement gaps. One of the things that's been observed about some of the sample tests that have come out is that the math tests are extremely wordy. It's like they're dense, they're hard to get through. And so instead of testing mathematics, they're kind of testing reading in a weird way. So let's say you're a Cambodian refugee who's come to the United States and is actually incredibly adept at math. Well, if you have a convoluted sentence with multiple dependent clauses and the math is somewhere embedded in that, you may not get a chance to show your math. And that's one of the problems here, that they're not differentiating enough between math and other aspects of things when they're doing this testing.
Thank you. And one last question. We hear one of the reasons, and it's not a very good reason, I think if you're going down the wrong road, you don't just hit the accelerator, but one reason we need to do this is because we've invested so much time and money. And so we are far down this, we've got to continue. One, I think I've heard from teachers that they appreciate some of the teacher preparation. I think that'll be good whether we stay with Common Core or do some kind of variation, because I think some of them are appreciative that there's been some more focus than what they're used to having. But I wanted to focus again on Dr. Schmidt 2 weeks ago said that, quote, the districts that have bought Common Core aligned textbooks, it has been a waste of money, and that there are on the market no serious textbooks worth anything. He said that very clearly, And so it doesn't seem to me that we're too far down the road. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that we should be promulgating that nobody should buy any more Common Core line textbooks, and that if you have them, you should try to get a credit for them and return them. So, you know, this argument is not a very good one anyway, that we're too far down, but it does seem to me that it would be hard to have tests and high stakes tests and teacher, you know, evaluations on teachers for tests that are supposedly Common Core aligned when we don't have textbooks by one of the preeminent people that have informed the writers of the Common Core that there's nothing good out there. So it just doesn't seem fair to think that we should get into these high stakes testing, and I think that it really kind of goes against this idea that we're too far down the road and that we can't slow down. And I appreciate, Dr. Stotsky, you mentioning the things that we can do. There's no reason why we can't improve our ELA standards. We had better standards in math than Common Core. You know, there's no need to turn this stuff over to the NGA and to SBAC, where we're not going to be able to do much change. We're not going to do any changes. So I don't know if you have any comments, but you know, I'm sure you're hearing the same things about we're too far down the road, we can't change, but it seems like we're not, and we should change and not adopt these, like you said. And there's very simple ways that we can meet NCLB and AYP without Common Core.
Certainly the state of Michigan has enough resources intellectually of its own that it can decide at the high school level what kinds of courses students should be taking, what should be in their syllabi, and even advise on the kind of textbooks that they should be buying. I don't understand the total disjunction between high school and college undergraduate level faculty, especially in a state that has a high level of literacy and many fine universities and colleges. That collaboration should surmount whatever a Department of Education on its own does. That was something I faced as an obstacle in the Michigan Department of Education, in the Massachusetts Department of Education, where we were for K-12, and then you had a Board of Higher Ed that dealt with education schools and all other things. So that piece alone can help deal with the issue of what should be, at least at the high school level, for teaching, and then let that drive what happens in K-6. We've done too much from the opposite end. As far as the other concerns, you'd have to use an analogy, like if you had patients dying in a hospital massively because a wrong medicine was being given and you had bought a huge supply, would you continue to let the patients continue dying, or would you say, let's throw out that supply of poison that we bought and start with something that we think has some scientific validity underlying it that would be better for the patients? I mean, you don't keep throwing good money after bad if you decide something is bad. And I understand the dilemma that many of you will face, even in your own communities. Here are people for Common Core, here are people against it, and they seem to be saying the opposite things. I've been trying to figure out, what do you do about civic discourse when you have people denying certain facts? And I even recommended to Arkansas a few weeks ago that they have a fact-finding committee and start looking. Are we or are we not internationally benchmarked? Are we or are we not research-based? And stop listening to these various voices or reading what's in print that's simply parroted all the time. I mean, it's possible for legislative committees to ask for fact-finding committees and see what are some of the facts and some of the issues. Get the people involved who determine college readiness. Find out what teachers who teach K1, 2, 3 actually think. It's very easy, in fact, it happens all the time, for people to say, we've only heard positive things. I understand this dilemma because it's a real issue. I found in Arkansas only one grade 8 English teacher who dared to speak up. There were addresses for a lot of others who had concerns through a national writing project. Only one dared to speak up publicly with her identity. Why? And she was told later on that she was not to speak up publicly anymore on curriculum and assessment. This was literally curbing her right to have freedom of speech. But there are many teachers at all grade levels who want to be seen as collegial, and they will speak in favor of something they know the administration is pushing. They are very reluctant to say anything negative and to be seen as an outlier because they will then be shunned. This is a common phenomenon. So you're not getting necessarily truthful information by having hordes of teachers coming up and saying, we think this is wonderful.
Thank you very much.
So may I just add one very quick point? And that is, in the 1960s, when we had this post-Sputnik new math, where they had extreme formalism, they had base systems other than the base 10, like you were learning math in base 7, all this sort of thing, all the school districts all over the country had invested in these books, and they got rid of them in only a few years. It was unwise. It didn't work.
Thank you both for your testimony and time today. Appreciate it. And we're running over. I'd like to get us out of here by 1 o'clock. I will be around to stay after to hear anybody that wants to testify, although I would, well, we'll talk about that after this. State Board of Ed, President John Austin, as well as Dr. Zeile.
Thank you. I'm glad we're here. Chairman Kelly, distinguished members of the House Committee, I'm John Austin, President of the Michigan State Board of Education. I've served on the State Board of Education for over 12 years, the last 3 as the President. I'm delighted to be joined today by fellow board member Dr. Richard Zeile, and also Eileen Weiser, who I know is familiar to the committee. Fellow board member is in the audience. For the record, let it be noted that I am a Democrat, Dr. Zeile a Republican, but as you will hear, we work together at the State Board in a strong bipartisan basis and find much common ground. First, let me say I appreciate and applaud the legislature's interest in holding these hearings and understanding more fully the history and the utility of the Common Core standards, which we as a State Board began the process of adoption in 2009. The legislature, the governor, and all of us have strong interest and stake in ensuring our education policies and practices are as effective as they must be to prepare all Michigan young people with the skills they need for successful life, work, and citizenship. Hopefully the testimony and discussions you have facilitated have contributed to your appreciation and I hope ultimate support for the Common Core standards as a set of foundational skills we want to continue to deliver in educating Michigan's young people. As I hope the committee members are also aware, our Michigan Constitution, naming and valuing education so highly, created an independent elected State Board of Education to provide leadership and supervision over all education. They made us statewide elected officials to give us strong independent voice, and they gave us long 8-year terms to buffer our decision-making from day to day and year-to-year political considerations and pressures. One of the principal powers of the board is to oversee and improve the state's learning standards and expectations for our young people. I have to say, we are the body, elected by the people, that is responsible for making, changing, and improving our state standards. Over the years, we have developed, approved, and then overseen with the support of the Department of Education the implementation of K-8 content standards and high school learning content expectations in all academic subjects, and really in all subjects, including social studies, science, the arts, math, and everything else. We absolutely periodically revise these standards to reflect new best research and educational practice in terms of what our young people need to know and be able to do to succeed in school and in their next steps in life. Always these standards, as we develop and change them, we involve expert-led education, expert processes with the guidance and leadership of our expert staff of the Department of Education. We draw on the best educational policy experts and practitioners in Michigan and from around the country, including our great higher education institutions. Our teachers have been intimately involved in the development of all of our standards and reviewing them and supporting them as they do in Michigan. We as a State Board of Education make sure that there's stakeholder input and public comment as we make our standards. And we often revise and make our own recommendations for changes in standards based on what we've heard and our own good judgment, which is what we are elected to do. And improving standards learning and improving these standards, which are so important because they're the frameworks that guide the education of our young people. In my experience, the State Board, we have always done so on a strong bipartisan and unanimous basis. Such was the case with the Common Core standards that we approved participating in the process beginning in 2009, and then we approved as our standards in math and language arts in 2010. As you are well aware, Mr. Chair, the Common Core was simply the latest improvement and refinement of state-based, statewide learning standards that we've been putting in place since the mid-90s in Michigan and in other states around the country. I would say at that time, this was prior to my board service, I was heading the Flint Roundtable, a civic business education leadership organization in Genesee County. I was working closely with then business leaders for Michigan, the precursor, the Michigan Business Leaders for Excellence under the Chamber. Governor John Engler asked me to chair the State School Work Steering Committee at that time, and I was working as an education policy consultant to the Clinton-era education department. So I was delighted when Governor Engler and Michigan joined other Democratic and Republican governors and their state business leadership organizations and formed the state-based standards movement. And they created Achieve to help them. You've heard from Michael Cohen that you've talked to Achieve to help develop these standards and this movement. The governor's business leaders and all of us working in education realized it was not fair to students and not helpful to their and our economic future to be teaching wildly different things in different corners of the state. All students in our state, from Marquette to Monroe, St. Clair to South Haven, deserved an education that gave them the same foundational skills and ability they need to go to community college, university, or technical school anywhere in Michigan and beyond to compete for entry-level jobs and good careers, as you heard from business leaders, anywhere, and be prepared to enter the military and be thoughtful and participating citizens. So since that time, and during my service on the State Board, we have been on a long march to put in place these learning standards. In the early part of my time on the board, and I remember well, we updated, put in place, and aligned more rigorous grade level K through 8 content standards. Spurred by the Cherry Commission, which Brian Cloyd and others served on, we made recommendations in 2004 and looking at other states and what we needed to do to encourage the right alignment of standards at the high school level. We extended these standards to a rigorous set of high school exit requirements, as Massachusetts and other states had done, that took us from a state that had one expectation for you to get a diploma from high school, you had to pass a civics course, to one of the leading states that ensured all high school students master needed competencies in math, language arts, science, social studies, foreign language, and the arts. I say it was misnamed the Michigan Merit Curriculum. It's not a curriculum. It's a set of competencies and credits in these subjects that you can teach and learn and deliver in any way, shape, or form and in any order. I remember well that in developing these standards, there were expert and stakeholder groups from Michigan, and we drew on the advice and learning frameworks of the best states with the help of Achieve and others. Now, as we made these changes, the national governors, the chief state school officers, and others were working with policy and education experts around the country to develop a best practice model only in math and language arts to help more states get in the game of at least having college and career-ready standards in these two important disciplines. That's the Common Core that we are discussing today. So I remember well when the Common Core standards and process to develop them were brought to us as a board with the idea that they might be the next stage improvement on the rigorous math and language arts standards we had already put in place. We asked the questions you would ask. Are we dumbing down or tuning up our standards? The answer, we're tuning up. How are they different? There are fewer standards, they demand deeper content knowledge and skill mastery, and they're an improvement on our already good standards. We had public hearings and discussion. We solicited stakeholder input, including the input of our teachers, our universities, our business community, and all of you. In 2009, we were happy to be one of the first states to approve their development, and in 2010, their use, as we wanted to continue to be one of the leading states in providing the foundation for learning that all our kids deserve. So that's one board member's perspective. Let me turn to Dr. Richard Zeile, who can share his perspective.
Thank you, President Austin. I want to commend you for your leadership of the State Board of Education, which has been a model of inclusiveness and consideration of conflicting perspectives. And I'm privileged to offer a somewhat conflicting perspective here. My own background is I've been on the board for 3 years, 2 as Michigan's delegate to the National Association of State Boards of Education. I've spent about 20 years teaching in the city of Detroit, some at mostly at Lutheran parochial schools, but also at some public schools. I helped organize the Old Redford Academy, which won a Golden Apple for its MEP scores eventually. So I have a varied background in some of these matters. I want to say that, first of all, that the federal usurpation of state determination of educational policy is a real issue. Half of the people working at the MDE offices are paid for out of federal grants, funded out of deficit spending. Either that or they take our money and give it back to us with strings attached. That's a real issue. But Common Core standards are a state-initiated, state-adopted policy that will be an incremental benefit to our schools and students and a cost saving to our state. As a conservative, I favor those. Now, Common Core has become a symbol of what everyone hates about the bureaucratic educational complex. You know, Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex, not because he was opposed to it, he was a part of it. But he recognized that its policies that it generated weren't always what the nation needed. And so it is well that we take a critical look at recommendations from our educational bureaucratic complex, of which I am a part. What I'm saying is that Common Core has become a symbol, and so we think of other things that have nothing to do with the Common Core, such as conspiracies or things of that nature. We are strictly speaking about the Common Core of math and English language arts standards, adopted by Michigan and some 40+ other states. There are proposed standards for science which are being deliberated by various states, including Michigan, but have not been adopted yet. As standards, these are rather pedestrian. The English standards shift some attention to reading for information as opposed to reading for pleasure. This shift from easier reading to more challenging reading skills has been misrepresented as dismissive of literature. The math standards emphasize fewer topics more thoroughly mastered than a superficial acquaintance with a greater number of topics. Mastering multiplication division before attempting algebra makes sense to me. Furthermore, Common Core will neither be the panacea that some of its advocates claim, nor the straitjacket that many of its critics think. The little acknowledged truth is that 85 to 95% of curricula, if we're speaking of math or English, covers the same ground. Our Lutheran parochial schools, in which I've been active for 25 years, never adopted the Michigan curricular framework, but our students did pretty well, considerably above the average on MEP tests. You see, curricula are like maps. Two maps of Michigan may differ in what details to include, but the basic shape is still the same. And successful teaching is less like painting a wall than it is lighting a fire. Kids teach themselves if you get them going right. Kids who master reading are reading all through the summer without summer classes requiring them to do so. Furthermore, in one sense, our students will be taught the Common Core whatever we decide, because most teachers, and now I'm giving away some professional secrets, rely on a textbook, especially early in their careers. In a day of 7 40-minute lessons, each taking at least an hour to prepare from scratch, you just cannot avoid using the prepared material a textbook has to offer, whether it's a printed or a cyber textbook. All available textbooks will incorporate the Common Core standards. Whether Michigan embraces these standards or not, the fact that 40+ other states have adopted them means that Common Core will be taught in our schools because they will inform the available textbooks. And that's not such a bad thing for a conservative educator. For Common Core standards represent baby steps toward a content-based rather than an exclusively skill-based, or even worse, the human potential-based curriculum of so-called progressive education. There's some definite things you ought to learn in school, and Common Core seeks to define these in a very minimal way. Now, let's not let the perfect curriculum, to my mind that would be Edie Hirsch's core knowledge curriculum, become the enemy of the good. There are many ways in which Common Core could be improved. So let's take this bare bones structure and erect what you will on top of it. It is intended to be a floor and not a ceiling. Once the basic skills are mastered, no school worth the name would be satisfied to allow students to learn only so much and no more. Common Core standards will not prevent a school that teaches successfully from continuing to do so, and they may help a struggling school find focus and get teachers and staff on the same page. And if you believe in testing and assessment for accountability, as I do, then Common Core standards, or something very like them, are necessary. One of the chief advantages of states adopting Common Core standards is the development of common state assessments, which will enable us to compare student performance across state lines. In one sense, it doesn't matter whether we use a yardstick or a meter stick to measure our students' growth, but let's agree on which one. I suggest we go along with the one that 40-some other states have adopted. I'd rather we spent 1/40th the cost of developing assessments than front the whole cost for developing our own. I'd like to conclude with this observation. Thomas Jefferson was a great advocate of states' rights and individual rights. But one of the things he's remembered for is giving us our monetary system. In his day, there were 13 colonies issuing their own money in their own conflicting systems, and many banks also had the same freedom. It was Jefferson who encouraged us to use the dollar divided into 100 cents, and this facilitated freedom and commerce rather than restricting it. There are some policies that facilitate freedom, and I believe in a very limited way that Common Core standards is one of those policies.
Thank you, gentlemen. Representative Yonker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is going to be coming from my frustration as a school board member under you guys' reign, so here's my opportunity.
It'll be lengthy.
Mr. Austin, you made, we'll keep this short. You made it, in 2004, we made our change to the Michigan Merit curriculum, all right? So then what happened after that is we had a couple years to implement this thing, all right? And then we had some cut score changes come in there, all right, which set us back another year. So the kids that were part of this system in 2004, by the time they got to the graduating where they were able to be under the new system, they only had one graduating class, and now we're switching to another system. Possibly two in there, all right, depending on where the kids were at. So we have businesses that are hiring these kids under the new standards, but the standards really haven't been able to get grounded well. And this is based on my other question I had is, I've seen this thing happen. I've seen teachers make the big shift. I've seen school boards, ours one, come up with the extra money to make the shift, textbooks, teacher training, and get the teachers good at what they're trying to teach. And the kids used to learning the material, and then we make another shift. So my question goes back to, why this standard? Why is this standard so much better? And are we not giving our other standard enough time to actually get established and be productive in what we're trying to achieve?
And again, that's an argument too for let's not change it again. But I understand your point and share your desire as we share. We should set the target and then let folks align to it and learn how to meet the target. And in 2004, with the high school level expectations, and I do want to emphasize, we had been on the process of building these standards into K-8 before that, and it's been a tremendous benefit to align what we expect every kid to learn in every subject through K-8. Then we needed to do it at the high school level, and it was a big change. And we did our most thoughtful version of exactly what we're talking about with the Common Core for all subject matter. How do we want to pitch our learning outcomes so that our young people have that foundation skills in all high school subjects that they'll need for not remediation in high school, technical school, university, and for good jobs. So the Michigan Merit was a big change in our standards. And it was excellent, but not perfect. When we've all been debating tweaks to that, which are perhaps well-intentioned and needed. I think as we then began to implement, and let me also say, setting high expectations as in the Michigan Merit set of standards. The naysayers then, as they were in Massachusetts and elsewhere when they went to a exit competency regime, said we'll have higher dropout rates, we'll see lower achievement. Both things have been, the opposite has been true, as we hoped. We've seen higher ACT scores, and we've seen higher graduation rates. Higher expectations are the first step, along with teacher support and better teaching, to deliver a great education for all young people, no matter what their background. Now, as I noted, the process that the NGA and the chief state school officers designed mostly for other states that had not gotten into this game of having a set of high standards in their state and setting high standards at the high school level. That's what the Common Core was dedicated to, is at least try to get states that are not in this party into this party, at least in math and language arts. And as you know, we revised our cut scores in this process because we wanted them to accurately reflect what performance should be to be proficient and not have a meaningless, proficiency bar. So we made that change, which is challenging but needed because it was the right thing to do. And I think as we looked at, are these, in these two subject areas, are these an improvement and refinement of our already high math and language arts standards, or are they a big radical change? We as a board, with the input of others in the field, basically said this is a modest, very modest improvement on our math and language arts standards that we set already under Michigan Merit. So it was worth the pain of change to make a small change for us, big change for other states that were not in the game of high standards at all, or who weren't in the game of high standards at the high school level. Modest change for us. That modest change seemed to be a good improvement that was worth pursuing. That's what we did as a state 2 years ago. It was not as controversial then as it is now. It was a almost no-brainer for us as a board with bipartisan support, and for the education field at the time. This makes sense. Let's refine and narrow and make more deep in those two subject areas what we're doing in all areas under the Michigan Merit. And so we said, let's do it, and let's make sure we have an assessment that aligns with it. And now, as you are well aware, educators like it, teachers like it, they view it as an improvement, and they want to continue to implement it.
Representative Pagel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will have a very brief and succinct question at the end of this that Amanda Price gave to me, but I just wanted to state that I appreciate your testimony. I've appreciated everyone that's testified in these 3 sessions. But the assertion that if I do not challenge someone that I must agree is false. I too have been on a school board. I chaired the school board from '93 to 2006. It was an interesting time. I've got a little background. There are statements I hear from certain testimony that, in my mind, I think are clearly false. And I may choose to challenge that, or I may choose to let it go and bide my time. And I've done that somewhat today, so please do not mistake silence for concurrence. Amanda Price asked me to ask the 2 of you that if we don't adopt Common Core, what's next?
My hope, I think we will continue, as I think Richard indicated, we'll continue to promote, advance the implementation of these good standards. And it will be up to the freedom of local districts, and we as a board will continue to exhort them through policy. If you hold money to support their implementation, it will only be a disservice, I believe, to the districts that want to continue to implement them as being better, tighter pieces of this high standards expectation set that we in Michigan have already advanced and done so on a strong bipartisan basis.
Representative Shore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. You've been here, you heard Diane Ravitch's testimony. She said specifically if we move the bar from 4 feet to 6 feet, or if we increase the bar and only accept A's, is what she said, for students to pass, we're setting our children up for bigger failure. We're kind of making it look like we've got more failure. I actually would like to hear your response to that.
You're the
Well, I thought your response was appropriate. Everything we know about how we improve outcomes and learning among all our young people, particularly those who have the furthest to travel, who happen to be often folks of color and poor, is that you have to have high expectations that they can learn as well, can score as well, can get the greatest education, go on to any and all futures that are possible for them in equal measure to any other kids. And so setting the same foundational skill platform, which is what we're talking about, basic skills in language arts, math, and numeracy at a level and in other subject matter areas that gives them the opportunity and to be prepared well for careers, for college, for technical school. That's what we're saying is the bar. And I think you do a huge disservice if you give up the ghost at the beginning. Everything we know from the data says you set our high expectations, and then we need to do the things that help them meet those expectations. Great schools, great teachers, all the things that deliver that ability. But this is job one, and all the evidence says high expectations pay off. If you expect a lot, you'll get a lot, and then you have to deliver the help to do it. So I think it's absolutely wrong to suggest otherwise. And I don't want to see us walk away from it, what are high but foundational skills that you can build on and go much further. I mean, we're talking about a basic platform that allows everyone to be decently prepared to take the next step.
Representative McMillan?
Mr. Chairman.
Zeile, did you want to?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You know, from one perspective, this card looks so much bigger than this one. And that's often the case with complex matters like educational standards. I just wanted to observe that the world of professional education, and especially as it overlaps with politics, is filled with hype. And so if you don't vote this way, you hate kids, or you don't care about kids. And we really need to clear through all of that kind of thing. In the same way, quality is not one-dimensional. What makes for requirements like Algebra 2 makes sense for a STEM themed school and preparing engineers. It might not make sense for a school devoted to world languages or arts, fine arts. So in adopting regulations to raise standards, you're actually, you may actually be cutting down on the diversity of educational offerings. So that's I think we need to take a three-dimensional view of these issues rather than fall into good, bad, etc.
Representative McMillan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming. Certainly it's very important for you folks to be here because one of you had voted for it and the other is certainly defending it. And so Mr. Austin, you said that high expectations pay off. Michigan has had at least as good or better standards in math than Common Core for many, many years, and they haven't paid off. So why is that?
One, we have seen upward movement in our performance, both graduation rates and ACT and test scores. We're nowhere near where we need to be. You won't like my other part of the answer is, as I said, setting high expectations is the first step, and having strong accountability systems that report on performance is a step. But the real step is to better financially support, robust learning and better support for teachers and better training for teachers so that they can help the kids learn the high standards, which we have not done in this state to the level we must. I'm all for high standards. We have reformed the heck out of our education system in Michigan, putting a lot of demands on our educators. We now need to provide much more support and help and investment in their delivery of great education if we want to move the needle. But standards are a piece of it, absolutely. You can't expect nothing, you get nothing.
Dr. Zeile, you mentioned that one of the reasons we need to go to SBAC is so that we can compare across states, but NAEP, it provides that very well for us right now. As a matter of fact, it does it without the testing and over-testing and pre-testing and post-testing of our kids. It does it statistically, very valid, and so we know now. So we don't need this. It might provide something different as far as tracking kids and all kinds of data that will be collected on our children, but we certainly don't need this to compare state to state. So I just want to say that. I hear, and I'm glad that you both mentioned that we're going to have fewer standards and we're going to have depth. I hear that all the time. Nobody has told me which standards in Michigan we dropped. So I hear we have fewer standards. Which standards, and I think this would be extremely important. I mean, if I were on the Board of Education, I want to know which ones we're dropping. So I would hope that you can enumerate a few standards that, since we're not as, we're having, you both said fewer standards, depth. Which standards did we drop?
All the ones related to fuzzy math and bad writing and reading.
No, specifically, I'm serious.
I mean, I believe Bill Schmidt and others who've testified have given examples of the narrowing and the depth of this. Even the previous testimony, I think, gave some illustrations of if we wanted to do addition, we're now encouraging depth of understanding, which leads to encouraging the teaching of that in a variety of ways. There's not just one way that you memorize to do your math. That's an example of how you can narrow and make more profound the learning standard. That we're not teaching exactly the way you add and subtract in the way we're familiar with. We're teaching addition and subtraction with an encouragement of multi-layered approaches. Those are some of the nature of the changes, as I believe our experts have helped us understand, are in these standards. And again, we ask these questions, and I think we're satisfied by the expertise we have here in Michigan in particular, and our Department of Education, to appreciate that the standards, the refinement of the standards from our math standards, for example, to the Common Core was fewer, more in-depth reasoning, and a better set of standards.
Okay, I mean, I heard there's more standards. I didn't hear less which standards were dropped, but nonetheless, I know I have a limited amount of time. On May's agenda, you had on the consent agenda, so you were ready to approve it without discussion. I guess you'd already had the discussion. The approval of the next generation science standards were set for approval. So is it the intent of the board to move forward with the next generation science standards? And I would assume you're not going to have 2 national tests, so you probably would fold that into the SBAC.
As I wrote you in your correspondence, which I appreciated, we are seeing, as has been noted, a improvement potentially in our science standards that are represented by the next wave of the national science standards that we are looking at and interested in discussing and potentially adopting if they are an improvement on our standards. We want to get through this discussion, and hopefully with an affirmative vote from you all, let's continue the course on the good quality Common Core standards in math and language arts, and then we will continue the public process and invite your participation in are the science standards revised that we have been participating in, the next generation, needed after it's been some 6 or 8 years. Some of your testifiers have said we should be revising our standards every few years, and as I indicated, that's what we do at the State Board of Education and in Michigan and in the department. So there is this process of developing a potential next set of science standards benchmarked to the best practice in science at the moment, after it's been a few years. So we'll be having public discussion about that in the near future, I'm sure.
Well, how are you going to revise your standards, as you say that is something that you should do, if you can't revise them if they're not going to be on the test? If you change standards and they conflict with what's going to be on the SBAC, how can you do that? So, I really feel that you're going to, knock on the NGA's door and hope that they'll change it so that SBAC will change it? Or, is there a formal way of saying, we are hearing from our teachers, this part is confusing, we need to change it, and we can guarantee the SBAC is going to change so that our kids aren't getting it wrong? I got correspondence from MDE saying, no, that's not true, we won't be able to change the standards because it's going to be on the test. You just said it's an important function of what you do is changing the standards. I'm being told we're not going to be able to.
So I believe, let me speak from our authority, and let me reassure folks, and I do think it's wrong to suggest that we are losing or have lost our state agency and decision-making in this process of setting standards, of participating in the development of the Common Core, of approving the Common Core and implementing it. As I tried to indicate, we take very seriously and we are responsible for this. We would only have participated, supported the Common Core, and we will only participate and support any next generation science standards if we believe, on behalf of the people of Michigan, with the full participation and support of the educators, business community, and others of Michigan, that this is a good set of standards, and then we have a good assessment to test those standards. First come the standards, then comes the assessment. So I totally disagree that we have either no ability, we are the decision makers, we are approving the Common Core. We did approve it because we thought it was a good, well-developed, with our input, but thoughtfully developed with the best minds in the country, set of state standards. And that's the only reason we approved it. If we didn't believe that, we wouldn't have approved it. And we will not approve any test. We believe the Smarter Balanced Assessment is a good assessment. Potentially, we want to make sure that as we implement it, we have an assessment that links to the standards. That's why we're doing this.
I understand, but you didn't answer my question. How about changes? It's clear there's going to be all kind of changes to this. Some may be good, some may be bad. We may want changes. So how going forward next year, 2 years from now, if we want to change it, what is the process of getting the change? Is it simply asking NGA to change it? Or is it saying we're going to do this whether NGA thinks it's right or not, even though it's copyrighted, because we know it's confusing and we need to change it? I'm being told by the MDE that we won't be able to change it. It's logical that we're not going to be able to because it's going to be on the SBAC, so you can't be teaching standards, when you're teaching to the tests that are different than what's going to be on the test. I get all this. The answer is always what you did before, and I'm not going there. I'm looking at in the future. Do you have control? And I don't believe you have control. If you want to change the standard, I don't believe you can. And I don't know that anybody. I haven't heard any of you say that you can, and how this is going to happen.
Well, first off, the tests which we have to review and have not adopted yet, these will be informed by feedback from 40 states or so that are issuing them. So we will be one of 40 states providing feedback, which is a powerful inducement to make logical and needed changes. Secondly, any school that teaches to the test reveals that they do not understand their craft. And this has been demonstrated in school after school in Michigan. Unfortunately, when you teach to the test, you lose any kind of long-term gain. Now, the school district in Armida is a textbook case. 10 years ago, they were near the bottom on MEP scores. They brought in a new superintendent who understood his craft. He brought in robotics, hands-on science, arts, dance, music, and their scores have gone up like 50 percentage points because he understood that enriching children's lives is what makes language and math meaningful, not more drill and kill.
Let me again emphasize, we set the standards, we approve them, we can change them, we have changed standards, we can approve tests, or we can change tests. We are pursuing participation in the Smarter Balanced Test Assessment, and as you know, Michigan is a leader in shaping what that's going to look like because we believe it will produce a good assessment that will link with the good Common Core standards that we've already approved.
But you signed documents that said you won't change the standards. SBAC requires you to fulfill the standards as copyrighted because that's what's going to be tested. So you can't change. You said you can change the standards. You can't change the standards. And my final question is this.
I disagree with your contention.
Well, I mean, it's just factual. And my final question is this, based on what Dr. Schmidt said, he was the one informing, as we heard 2 weeks ago, he was the one giving input into the development of Common Core from Michigan. He said that the textbooks being purchased, $1.5 million on the west side of the state by one district, was a waste of money and that there are no serious textbooks worth anything in the Common Core aligned so-called market. So given that, I think that's quite alarming. We're going to be testing based on something that they have faulty textbooks. I would hope we're not going to do any testing anytime soon. But I think you should be, I really think you should.
We only set standards, we don't require textbooks.
No, I really think that, are you going to be advising districts to not buy any more textbooks, Common Core line textbooks, and return the ones you have to try to get credit because they are clearly faulty based on one of our main experts of Common Core here in Michigan?
Let me remind us, we set standards. We set standards. They're standards. We have nothing to say about textbooks, curriculum, how they're taught, how they're delivered. And so I imagine what Mr. Schmidt was suggesting was, in the desire to make money, some textbook companies are probably putting out textbooks that they think link to the Common Core that aren't necessarily of quality.
He said none
could be concerned.
He said none are on the market.
But the standards are of quality, and we should continue, in my opinion, and the opinion of the state board, and the educators, teachers unions, business leaders, and the predominant experts in the profession to help us continue on this path of high learning expectations for all our young people.
Thank you, Representative Singh.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to be a little bit more respectful of our two guests here. I appreciate Dr. Z you being here, and President Austin for being here as well. I guess I do want to get a sense on this last set of questions in regards to the control that the State Board of Education have. I mean, it's very clear in our Constitution you have the control to do a certain amount of things. We have obviously budgetary relationship to that within our constitutional provisions. But as you go forward with this and taking a look at the NGA and the relationship with the NGA, do you feel that you have the ability to develop the set of standards for the state of Michigan, change standards as you see fit as the Board of Education, as our Constitution dictates to you?
Let me answer simply, absolutely. And let me elaborate on the beginning of your question. I think it's really helpful to reflect on how do we want as a state to set these learning expectations. And I do think, with due respect to a legitimate, wonderful legislative interest in making sure we're getting it right, that the process that Michigan almost uniquely has of a independent state board, again, with kind of long-term view, functioning on a bipartisan basis, charging expert-led, fully input-driven processes around any time we iterate or evolve our standards, is a thoughtful way to try to both set and reset episodically, hopefully not every year like Representative Yonkers was saying, that learning bar. That's a good way to do it. I don't think we would want to have legislatures change 2 years, every 2 years reset the learning standards. So I think, while not perfect, this is a good approach for us to take a long view and develop thoughtful, content-driven, expert-driven, that we also are on the hook to reflect on and improve as a state board. It's worked well. I think it continues to work well. I feel the reason we, as I indicated, as Chairman Kelly knows, when Achiever was created, it was a very good vehicle created by the governors and the business roundtables in their states to help design thoughtful state common standards. They do good work. They helped us with the Cherry Commission, as did many of the other higher education and other experts. So it is totally helpful to draw on the best thinking in the field of state-based standards from around the country, facilitated by organizations and entities like Achieve. But again, if we in Michigan don't believe, as the elected officials, you and us, that they're helpful and informing what we think is the right set of standards, we would not support or embrace them in whole or in part. As I said, we don't always embrace things in whole. We often change them. We change them when we develop them ourselves. We change them, and I think we will change them. If they prove to be wrong or don't work, we'll get out of this thing. We have that ability. It is not a federal giveaway or to unknown bureaucrats. It is a state deciding to improve their standards, looking for the best help and expertise to do that possible. That's what we're about here.
Representative O'Brien, or Dr. Z,
I just wanted to say the state board's functions are described as advising the legislature and the governor. We do select the superintendent of public instruction as part of the most significant thing that we do, and require accountability of the Michigan Department of Education. So our real power in this area is the power of a good, consistent, workable idea. I think the Common Core standards, if they're used sensibly, are a good idea. Some things will be done in the name of Common Core to disrupt some schools. That's the fault of the individuals who are attempting to implement them. And we've seen from past standards, poor implementation in the wrong way. That's not the function of the standards themselves, but a misapplication of a good idea.
Representative O'Brien, last question.
Thank you, and my questions are limited to two. First, when we're talking about policy, I guess I'd have a little bit of disagreement thinking that there are many policy issues that really are a shared responsibility. But my first question would be, if you believe that you are the sole policy arm, are we then expected to pay and support any policy that comes forth? I I reckon that with I'm a mom of 2 teenagers, and as they're discussing where they would like to go to school, it's easy for them to have that discussion when they expect me to pay the bill. And I said, if I'm paying the bill, I have ultimate choice. And then my second question is, don't you have questions or concerns with a full-scale implementation of something that's never even been piloted?
As I hope you'll reflect in my testimony, I absolutely not only acknowledge but welcome the shared interest, shared responsibility for policy making and shaping in education, which we all care about. Legislature, governor, state board, everybody here. And that's why I applaud this discussion and these series of discussions you've had. It is absolutely legitimate and appropriate when we have a system that has worked well of a state board that one of its few direct responsibilities is to continually revise and shape the learning standards, to share and discuss fully with you legislators the nature of those standards and whether they're right, et cetera, et cetera. So we welcome that. It is very healthy. We need to have this discussion. My hope is that it will help confirm, in this case, and that this is a quality move for improving education in Michigan. I absolutely, your second part of your question, I think part of it came up today earlier. What was the second part? I'm sorry.
Aren't you concerned with implementing something full-scale that's never even been
I think,
piloted?
as Representative Shore indicated, we're basically doing, and Dr. Zeile said as much, the Common Core, in our view, was a baby step on the many, many steps up the ladder of developing high standards, improving them periodically every 6 or 7 years in our content areas. So this was for Michigan, again, not for other states, the ones that had to be incented by Race to the Top, which we didn't have to. We were already deciding, yes, if this is a slight improvement on already high standards, we welcome it. We don't need Race to the Top to get there. So it is a natural next step in the way we do our standards, which is we have standards now in discipline areas. We look to periodically revise them with the best expertise based on experience of what's working in the field in Michigan, around the country, from educators, from teachers, from our education policy, higher ed experts. So when we put in place a new set of standards that's developed through this collective expert-led process, it's trying to build on what we know in a discipline might want to be improved to teach it more effectively. So it's not like we're starting from ground zero. And the Common Core in math and language arts, we're using the same process to say this could be an improvement on some of your state-based standards for all states. And in Michigan's case, it could be a slight, this is the discussion we had at the board level. No, this is actually just a slight improvement on our standards. So it's worth us making that improvement if it's being offered to us. It's not a whole new, radically untested thing, but it's not something that we need to road test, because as we do standards, this is how we do them. And it's helped us improve learning outcomes the way we've been doing this as a state and in other states.
But maybe it hasn't worked. As a mom, that's the hat that I wear here. I'm a mom of 2 kids. I think the state has failed our kids. I do not like the Michigan Merit Curriculum. I do not like the MEAT. I see the stress that my kids go through for the MEAT. The ACT was very easy. The ACT is not stressful at all. And I just sit here and think, in order to impact change, I have to lobby some school board members that most people don't even know who they are at the state school board. People know who I am. I mean, they somehow get my phone number all over the place. I live in their community. They know where I live. I'm a public figure. Before I got to Lansing, I didn't know who my school board members were, but my local school board, I know who they are. I know where they live, and I know how to find them. So when I have a concern, I can get right to them. But they don't make decisions about curriculum. So when people come to me and say, our kids are overweight, they're not learning this, they're not learning that, well, go lobby your state school board. Well, who are they? They don't even remember voting for you. And so it's not that you're doing a bad job. I just worry we're having too much of an intellectual discussion when me as a mom, I don't care. It's not working for my kids. I don't like it. That's all great. I don't trust what's happening.
And that lack of trust grows directly out of the hype that surrounds much of professional education.
Thank you.
when I've heard presentations on Common Core where the presenter says, this is going to change everything, and it's not. It's not that big a deal. It's not that big a change. It's simply getting everyone in the 40-some states to get more or less on the same page, and it's wrong for us to believe the hype.
Well, Chairman, if I can just have one comment and I'll then be silent. I'm not wearing a tinfoil hat, and in fact, some of the people in my community feel I am not strong enough against Common Core. So when I speak about this issue, I get hit people from the right and the left, people who say, Margaret, you should be carrying the flag and saying this is a conspiracy. I've not said it. And so we just have to caution, when I wear my mom hat, I'm looking for what's best for my kids so they're going to be independent long-term, they're going to have happy, healthy lives, however they determine it to be. And when we start using emotional terms and saying, this is just hype, then it feels like you're being dismissive of the real concerns that I said all along. And I remember when you campaigned the state, Dr. Z, you know, you're a very smart and intelligent man, and I know you don't want to be dismissive. But when it's going, your concerns are part of this bigger hype issue, no, I can name people in this audience who've been mad at me for not being against Common Core.
Let me put it to you this way. Curriculum is the map. Our schools are the automobiles. Not every automobile is fit to run on the map. Your responsibility is to check your local school, your local district, and make sure that it's fit to run. If it's fit to run, it doesn't matter whether you're using Common Core or another curriculum. Your kids will learn because learning is like lighting a fire. There are questions on the SAT and ACT that are not taught in any school, but they need those questions to differentiate the 98th percentile from the 99th percentile. Where does the 99th percentile learn it? They learn it on their own because someone lit a fire and they continued learning for life.
Mr. Austin, please wrap up.
With respect, I do believe that when we do things like ensure that there's a minimal foundation through the Michigan Merit for all high school students and their families getting a good education that is needed to go to Grand Valley or University of Michigan or Macomb Community College or to work, that we are living up to our responsibilities to advance the kind of education that parents and kids do need and expect. So I think we are trying to deliver on what is needed. And I hope you will hear from all the people in Michigan. I wish at every forum you could, and maybe, or Representative Kelly, you will be here doing that today. I would like to say that we from Michigan, and you've heard presenters today, advocates of Common Core who are from the Michigan business community and your elected state board members, and you've heard opponents of the Common Core who are not from Michigan. And I do believe that it's important to listen to all Michiganders for and against.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody's patience, indulgence. Appreciate your testimony, Dr. Z, Mr. Austin, today. Thank you for being here.